I woke up to the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't the kind of peaceful exhale that comes with sleep's end. No, this was jagged, shallow, as if I had been running in my dreams, far from something warm or comforting. The sheets clung to my skin, damp and cold, and I didn't remember tossing and turning. It felt as though something had been watching me all night. The room was eerily still, the only movement the dim flicker of my old desk lamp casting long shadows across the clutter. I rubbed my eyes and stared at the familiar surroundings, my tiny apartment in the heart of the city, surrounded by abandoned canvases, brushes, and half-finished paintings that lined the walls like forgotten memories. It was the kind of place an artist like me should have found inspiring, but lately, it felt like a tomb. I looked at the clock on the wall, 4:37 a.m. The numbers blinked back at me, unforgiving. I had tried to sleep through the night, but these dreams, these visions, kept breaking through. They were never clear, never easy to understand. A chill shuddered down my spine. I slowly turned toward the corner of the room where a large canvas rested, covered by a cloth. That damn thing had been sitting there for weeks. I hadn't even bothered to look at it. My inspiration had dried up long ago, leaving nothing but a sense of stagnation, of loss. But today, as my gaze lingered on it, something felt wrong. I stood, walking toward it, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the carpet. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold knot of dread form in the pit of my stomach. Something was off. I reached for the cloth, hesitated for a moment, and then pulled it away. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, what had been in my dreams. The same scene, the same details, painted in painstaking precision. A woman, her face twisted in agony, stood in a barren field under a sky that wasn't quite day, nor was it night. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape as if she were screaming, but no sound came. Her hands were held high, as if reaching for something, or perhaps trying to escape something unseen. There was a darkness at the edge of the canvas, creeping toward her like a shadow that had a life of its own. I stumbled backward, knocking into my chair. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I couldn't explain how it had gotten there. I hadn't painted it. I couldn't remember the last time I had painted anything. It had been weeks, maybe longer. And yet, here it was, as real as the sweat on my brow. I turned around in a daze, my mind scrambling to make sense of the surreal scene in front of me. How could this be? How could something that I had only seen in my dreams appear in the waking world? I tried to steady my breath, but it felt like something was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I unlocked it. No messages. No calls. Nothing out of the ordinary. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who could I talk to about this? No one would believe me. I could barely believe it myself. I stared at the painting again, and a creeping unease twisted in my gut. The colors, there was something about them that felt wrong, almost too vivid. The shades of red in the woman's eyes were so sharp, they made my own pupils ache. And the darkness at the edge of the canvas seemed to writhe, as if it were alive, waiting to spill out from the frame and into the room. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something felt wrong. Like I had opened a door, but I didn't know what was standing on the other side. It was as if the dream had been waiting for me, calling me. But then, I noticed something else. The corner of the canvas had a mark, a smudge that shouldn't have been there. It was a dark stain, a smear of something that hadn't been there the last time I had looked. My mind raced. I reached for a brush, dipping it into the nearest paint and carefully adding a few strokes to cover the stain. As I did, the sensation grew stronger, almost demanding, like the canvas itself was alive and responding to my touch. I had to stop. My fingers were still covered in paint, but the stain was gone. It was as though the painting had absorbed the mark. The moment I let go of the brush, I saw it again. The stain was back, this time more pronounced than before. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and leaned closer. The woman's face in the painting seemed to twist. Her mouth moved. I jumped back, knocking over my easel in a panic motion. The chair scraped against the floor with an awful screech as I scrambled away from the painting. My heart thudded in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my throat, thick and loud. And then, just as quickly as the fear had taken hold, it receded. The room was silent again. But I knew, deep down, this wasn't normal. The paintings, the dreams, the strange feeling of presence in the room, it was all connected. And it wasn't just the canvas. I turned to look at the rest of my room, my heart still racing. Was I seeing things? Was it all just a trick of the mind, a manifestation of stress? My lack of sleep? I had been struggling, drowning, in the fear that I would never find my voice again as an artist. That this thing inside me would win. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands gripping my knees. Every inch of me screamed to leave the apartment, to get out of the claustrophobic space, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was as though the apartment had grown too familiar, too intertwined with my thoughts. I had spent too many nights here, and the walls had become too much a part of my psyche. I closed my eyes, desperate to shake the images from my mind. But the woman's face, the way she screamed without making a sound, kept haunting my thoughts. I couldn't escape her. No matter where I turned, no matter what I did, she was there. Her eyes drilled into my skull. The worst part? I had seen her before. In the mirror. I had seen her staring back at me in the reflection, hidden in the shadows at the edge of my consciousness. But this time, she had stepped out of my mind and onto the canvas. I needed to finish it, to understand it, to make sense of the horror that was slowly consuming me. But something deep inside told me that finishing the painting wouldn't solve anything. It would only make it worse. The question was, how long before it consumed me completely? The days blurred together. Every morning, I woke to the same oppressive silence, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The woman in the painting haunted me, her agonized expression frozen in time, her eyes accusing me of something I couldn't remember. The longer I stayed in my apartment, the more my own reflection seemed foreign, like someone else was staring back at me. Someone with too many secrets. I had tried to forget it all. I told myself it was just a weird episode, some twisted manifestation of stress. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the painting was always there, waiting. The smudge. The stain that came back every time I tried to fix it. It was as though the canvas itself was mocking me, rejecting every effort to correct it. On the third night, I couldn't stand it any longer. My mind felt like it was coming apart at the seams. I grabbed my brushes, my fingers trembling as I set them down next to the painting. I stared at the woman's face, the shape of her mouth, the unnatural angle of her hands reaching upward. I needed to finish it. I needed to find closure, some sense of control over what was happening to me. I took the brush in hand, and with a trembling stroke, I began painting over the smudge. But as soon as the bristles touched the canvas, it felt like something snapped inside me. A rush of coldness spread across my skin, and the room seemed to shift, its edges growing distant, blurry, as if the very air was suffocating. I gasped for breath. The world around me tilted, and for a moment, I was no longer in my apartment. I stood in the field that I had seen in my dream. The same dark sky hung above me, and the woman, now in full form, was there, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I could feel the earth beneath my feet, the cold wind on my face. My hand jerked back from the canvas, and I stumbled backwards, panic clawing at my throat. I wasn't in the field anymore. I was in my room again, gasping for air, but the cold still lingered, drenched in my sweat. And the painting, it was different. The woman's figure seemed more real than before. Her eyes were alive, staring at me as though she could see right through me. The darkness at the edges of the canvas had expanded, creeping further into the room. It was no longer just an image on a canvas, it was something that was bleeding out into my reality. My pulse quickened, and I fell to my knees, feeling the walls close in on me. The brush fell from my hand, clattering onto the floor, but I didn't move to pick it up. I couldn't look away from the painting. I felt it, the sensation of being watched not just by the woman, but by something far more ancient, more malevolent. It was as if the painting itself had become a portal, a doorway to something that wasn't supposed to exist in this world. I closed my eyes, pressing my palms into my face, but it was no use. The vision burned into the back of my eyelids. I opened my eyes again, and the canvas was changing. In the middle of the night, as the city outside my window remained asleep, I couldn't escape the overwhelming compulsion to keep painting. I had to finish it. I had to know what would happen if I did. I grabbed the brush again, my hand shaking. The woman on the canvas beckoned me forward, as if urging me to finish the nightmare she had started. My thoughts felt sluggish, almost drugged, as I began to paint over her outstretched arms. Each brushstroke felt like a betrayal of my sanity. The darkness at the edge of the painting thickened as I worked, reaching out toward me like an entity in its own right. I was no longer painting a figure. I was painting a prison, one that would trap me in the suffocating grip of its nightmare forever. When I finished, the room felt different. Cold, like the air had been replaced with something heavier, something thicker. The walls seemed to press in, and the shadows in the corners deepened. I didn't want to look at the painting, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. And there it was. The woman had moved. Her hands were no longer reaching out, they were pulled back toward her chest, as if she were pulling herself into the canvas. The darkness had spread, overtaking her once pure figure. But it wasn't just the painting that had changed. The room itself felt different. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, casting strange, twisting shapes against the walls. I could hear something, whispers, too low to make out but growing louder, like a chorus of voices hidden in the walls themselves. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of the apartment, but my body wouldn't move. I approached the painting, against all logic, drawn to it by an unseen force. And that's when I saw it. At the bottom of the canvas, barely visible in the darkened corner, there was a small detail I hadn't noticed before. A message, scrawled in jagged strokes of paint. It was written in a hand I didn't recognize, but the letters were unmistakable. "She's coming for you." The moment I saw the words, something snapped. The air in the room thickened, choking me, and I stumbled back, my legs trembling beneath me. My pulse raced, and I could taste the bile rising in my throat. "She's coming for you." It felt like the walls were closing in, pressing me into a shrinking space, forcing me to look at the painting again and again. I didn't want to, but I couldn't look away. Her eyes, they moved. They followed me, no matter where I went in the room. And that darkness, it wasn't just the edges of the canvas anymore. The blackness had crept beyond the frame, curling around the edges like smoke, pulling at the corners of my vision. I stumbled backward, my mind a swirling mess of fear and confusion. How was this happening? This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a painting, just something I had painted in my sleep, in my dreams. Yet it had become something far worse. I turned away from the canvas, fighting the overwhelming urge to break down in tears. My breathing was ragged. My heart was still pounding as though I were running, but I hadn't moved. I hadn't left the room. Suddenly, I heard a faint creak from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my body stiff as a board. I could feel it now, the presence in the room, the one I had tried to ignore. It was there, standing behind me, just outside of my vision. But I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I could feel her eyes on me. The woman from the painting. My heart pounded in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of here, but my legs refused to move. But then, through the haze of fear, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper coming from behind me. "You finished it." I whipped around, but there was nothing there. No woman, no figure. Just a painting. But now the eyes, her eyes, were no longer cold. They were pleading, begging. And at the center of the painting, behind the woman's tortured face, was a dark shape. A shape that wasn't supposed to be there. A hand reaching out toward me from within the canvas. A hand that was stretching out from the painting, from the darkness, reaching for me. The brush fell from my hand as my legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, staring at the canvas. The painting was no longer a mirror image, it was a portal. A doorway into the very thing that had been haunting me. I had finished it. And now, there would be no turning back. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart still pounding in my chest. The room was shrouded in a thick fog, and the silence was so complete it felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I lay there for a long time, unsure of where I was, or even what time it was. My thoughts were foggy, muddled from the dream, or perhaps it was more than a dream. The painting, it was real. I sat up slowly, my body stiff with fear, my legs unsteady as I swung them over the edge of the bed. My eyes darted to the far corner of the room. There it was, the canvas, still leaning against the wall. The brush that had fallen the night before lay on the floor beside it. I didn't want to look at it. The air was thick with dread, but the pull of the painting was unbearable, like a magnet drawing me in. I stood up shakily, my hands trembling as I wiped my forehead. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, like they were closing in on me. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to walk toward the canvas. I didn't know why. I had no logical explanation for why I needed to see it, but there it was, a compulsion I couldn't resist. When I reached the painting, I hesitated. The woman's face seemed different this time, more alive. Her eyes weren't just staring at me anymore. They were tracking me, following my every movement, her expression shifting as if she was trying to communicate. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow as I examined the painting. And that's when I saw it. The hand. It wasn't just a shape anymore, it was a fully formed arm, reaching out from the depths of the canvas, fingers curling toward me like it was trying to pull me inside. I staggered backward, my heart thundering in my chest. The room seemed to close in tighter around me, as if the painting's reach was growing, stretching out beyond the canvas, threatening to swallow me whole. I turned away from the painting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the feeling didn't go away. The presence in the room, that suffocating, all-consuming presence, it was still there. Watching. Waiting. I knew I had to get out. I had to leave the apartment. But the moment I reached for the door handle, I froze. From behind me, I heard a faint whisper. "You can't leave." I spun around, my eyes wide, but the room was empty. The painting still stood there, its grip on reality tightening, and yet there was no sign of any figure or presence, only the painting, its darkened hues creeping further into the canvas. But I could feel it. I could feel her. She was there, watching me. "You can't leave." The voice had come from the painting. It was unmistakable now. I staggered back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. This was madness. But the more I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a bad dream, the more I felt reality slip away from me. I stepped toward the painting again, drawn to it against my will. My hand hovered above the frame, my fingers trembling. I wanted to tear it down, rip it apart. But I was frozen, unable to break free from its magnetic pull. "Finish it." The words rang in my head, repeating over and over again, echoing like a command. My hand moved on its own accord, reaching out to touch the canvas. The moment my fingers made contact with the cool surface, a jolt of cold rushed through me. It felt like I was touching something alive, something that didn't belong in this world. The painting trembled beneath my touch, and then, without warning, it shifted. The edges of the frame began to bend and warp, as though the painting itself was alive, breathing, expanding. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The darkness inside the painting was no longer just a background. It was reaching out, pulling at me like an inky tide. And then, from within that blackness, I saw her, the woman, her face twisted in an expression of pure agony. She was no longer just trapped within the canvas. She was coming out. I staggered back, my mind spinning, and the world seemed to tilt. The shadows in the room reached forward, their tendrils curling like fingers around my arms and legs. I was no longer in control of my body. I had to finish it. I grabbed the brush that had fallen to the floor, the bristles still wet with paint from the previous night. But as soon as I lifted it, my hand trembled uncontrollably. The paint was thick, black, like the tar of nightmares, and it seemed to drip with an unnatural weight. With every stroke I made, I felt myself slipping into something darker, deeper. I was no longer painting a picture. I was painting my fate. I don't remember how long I was at the canvas. Time had no meaning. All I knew was that I was trapped, caught between what was real and what wasn't, struggling to hold on to the fragments of myself that hadn't already been consumed by the painting. When I finally stepped back, the room was still. But it wasn't the same. The woman's face was gone, replaced by an image I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The scene had shifted, and in its place stood something worse. The blackness had overtaken the canvas entirely. The woman's tortured face was now a part of the background, her features blurred into the dark shadows that swallowed the painting whole. But there, in the center of it all, was a figure, a man, standing alone in the emptiness. His face was obscured by shadows, but his hands were outstretched, as though calling to me. "Come to me." The whisper echoed in my mind again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. The brush dropped from my hand, and I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The room was spinning, the walls pulsing with a rhythm that was both foreign and familiar. My body trembled as I collapsed onto the floor, staring up at the canvas. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow, no, a figure, moved inside the painting. The man's hands were no longer outstretched, they were reaching for me. His fingers twisted unnaturally as if the limbs were not meant to move like that. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I was no longer alone in the room. A whisper. Soft. Distant. And then, suddenly, closer. Come closer. The voice was cold, distant, but somehow unmistakable. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. The figure, the man, stepped forward, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. The shadows writhed as though they were alive, and the figure's outstretched hands reached for me. I had to leave. But I couldn't. The pull was unbearable. "You finished it," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just the painting speaking. The room itself seemed to breathe, the walls closing in, the air thick with dread. I had finished it. The final stroke had been made. There was no turning back. I reached for the door again, but the moment my hand touched the handle, the room trembled. The door refused to open. And then the whispers grew louder. "Come closer. Step inside." I could feel the temperature in the room drop, the coldness seeping into my skin. The man in the painting was no longer just a figure. He was alive. He was reaching for me, his fingers twitching, pulling me in. I closed my eyes, unable to look anymore, but I could still hear his voice. Still feel his presence. The painting wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in my apartment. The walls that had once been filled with the unsettling silence were now gone, replaced by an endless stretch of dark, swirling fog. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin, a biting cold that made my bones ache. There was no light, no warmth, just the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. I stood up, disoriented, my head spinning. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if I were walking on a thin layer of ice that might crack at any moment. I reached out, hoping to find something solid, something familiar. My fingers brushed against a smooth, cool surface, and when I looked up, I saw the painting. It was no longer confined to the canvas in my room. It had expanded, spreading across the vast nothingness around me like a living thing, its dark, swirling tendrils creeping into the void. The man, the figure, stood at the center of it, his face still obscured by shadows, but his eyes, those eyes, were now clear, wide, and full of something that made my skin crawl. He knew me. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me seemed to stretch and contract, as if I were being pulled into the very fabric of the painting. Every step I took was like walking through thick mud, the air growing heavier with every movement. The fog seemed to press closer, swirling around me like it had a life of its own. I could feel the eyes of the man on me, and I knew he was watching, waiting. I tried to move away, to escape, but I couldn't. My feet refused to obey me, my body paralyzed with fear. I was trapped. "You can't leave," the voice from the painting whispered. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence, a force that seemed to fill the entire space. I turned around, frantic, desperate for an exit, but the endless fog stretched in all directions. I could no longer see the apartment, the world I had once known. All that remained was this swirling void and the man at the center of it. And then, I saw her, the woman. The one from the painting. She wasn't trapped inside the canvas anymore. She was here, standing just beyond the man's reach, her face twisted in torment. Her eyes were wide, pleading, as if she were trying to warn me. She reached out, her arms desperate, but the shadows from the painting clung to her like a shroud, pulling her back into the darkness. I reached out instinctively, but as I did, the man's shadowed hands jerked forward. His fingers curled and twisted like they were being pulled by some unnatural force. His grip was inescapable, cold, suffocating. And then, he stepped forward. His face, hidden before, finally emerged from the shadows, and I was face to face with the man from the painting. His eyes, they weren't human. They were dark pools, swirling with endless depth, with a hunger that seemed to pierce straight through me. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was a mockery. He had been waiting for me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. I could feel the weight of the painting's darkness pressing against me, consuming everything I was. I wasn't just standing in front of the painting anymore. I was in it, immersed in it, becoming a part of its twisted reality. I could hear the whispers again, the same voice, but now I was joined by others, a chorus of distorted voices. All of them had been waiting for me. "Finish it," the voices demanded, echoing in my head, reverberating in my skull. I turned to look at the woman again, her face contorted with pain, her mouth open as though she were trying to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped. We were all trapped. And then, I understood. The paintings. The dreams. The brush strokes. It wasn't just an obsession. It wasn't just a story I had been painting. It was my fate. The man, the figure, wasn't just part of the painting. He was the painting. He was a creation, a manifestation of the darkness that had been feeding on me, on my fear, on my art. I had given him life. I had trapped myself in the nightmare I had created. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and as I did, the painting seemed to breathe. The edges rippled, and the shadows closed in around me, pulling me closer to the man. His cold eyes bored into mine, and I could feel his fingers reach for me, his touch as cold as death itself. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was weak and broken. "I won't finish it. I won't let you." But it was too late. The darkness closed in on me, and I was pulled into the painting, into the man's embrace. I could feel my body dissolving, my soul being absorbed into the very canvas I had created. I was no longer me. I was him, a part of the painting, a part of the nightmare. And then, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sheets were soaked with sweat, my breath shallow and ragged. I could hear the distant hum of the city outside, the sound of cars, the noise of life continuing on. But it wasn't the same. I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the room. It was familiar, yet wrong. The walls seemed to press closer, the shadows stretching longer than they should. The air felt thicker, as if something had changed. And then, I saw it. The painting. It was back. But it wasn't the same. This time, the painting had changed. The woman was still there, her face twisted in agony, her eyes pleading for help. But now, there was a man standing next to her. A man I knew too well. It was me. And in the corner of the canvas, a single phrase had been painted in bold, jagged strokes. "The artist is never free." I took a step back, my legs unsteady. My hand reached out, trembling, to touch the painting, but as soon as my fingers brushed the surface, a cold jolt shot through my body. It felt like the painting was alive, like it was waiting for me to finish it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I turned away from the painting, my breath shallow. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I moved toward the door, I saw the brush in the corner of the room. It was there, waiting for me, just as it had been in my dreams. I turned back to the painting. And then I understood. I would never escape. Not from this, not from the art. Because in the end, it was all the same. The paintings in my dreams were never just dreams. They were my reality. Story 2. It was a Tuesday when I first saw him, though I didn't know it at the time. Mornings had a dull consistency to them, just like the streetlights casting their half-hearted glow across the darkened pavement. I was always early, arriving at the bus stop just as the last train of commuters from the previous day's shift rolled out of view, fading into the distance. The city buzzed in a tired rhythm, people jostled and hurried, always pressed for time. But I wasn't one of them. I was a late riser. Too many restless nights had made mornings a struggle. And yet, here I was, standing at the bus stop on the corner of Pine and 5th, waiting for the 7:15 bus to take me to a job I hated. I didn't know why I hated it. It wasn't a bad gig. Maybe it was the routine, the monotony, or maybe it was the way the sky always felt too heavy in the mornings. The gray clouds, the cool air biting at my exposed skin. It wasn't until I noticed the man that I began to question the very fabric of my daily existence. He wasn't like the others. A part of me thought maybe I'd seen him before, his unkempt clothes, a cheap coat that didn't quite fit, eyes that looked too tired for the rest of his face. He was standing a little off to the side, leaning against the streetlight, smiling faintly. His teeth were too white, too perfect in contrast with his disheveled appearance. His smile, however, was unlike any I'd seen before. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was unsettling. I shifted uncomfortably, adjusting my backpack on my shoulder, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. People smiled all the time, right? It was just the way he was standing, so still, so out of place. The other commuters didn't seem to notice him, passing him without a second glance. But I couldn't look away. His eyes locked with mine, and I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. The bus came, as it always did, but I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. I climbed aboard, mindlessly taking a seat by the window, staring out as the city passed by. The rhythmic hum of the engine was soothing, but it couldn't drown out the feeling gnawing at me. Every few seconds, I would glance back toward the stop. He wasn't there anymore. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my own imagination running wild. But as the bus rounded the corner of 6th, I saw him again. Standing by the curb. Smiling. This time, the smile seemed bigger, more pronounced, almost too wide. I wanted to look away, but my eyes wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear myself from the sight of him, his face locked in an unnatural expression. And then, just as the bus passed him, he was gone. I blinked and looked again, my heart beating too fast, too hard in my chest. The spot by the curb was empty. Nothing but the streetlights, the same old sign for a dry cleaners, and the cool morning air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe I had imagined it. But I couldn't shake the image of that smile. The next day, I arrived at the bus stop a few minutes earlier. I wasn't sure why I did it. I hadn't planned on doing anything differently, but there I was, standing in the familiar, cold darkness, waiting for the 7:15 bus to pull up. The streetlights flickered overhead, and the hum of distant cars blended with the faint whispers of the wind. And there he was again. The man. The same one. He was standing just a few feet away from where I had stood the day before, leaning against the light pole. His face was angled slightly, as if watching something, or perhaps someone. When he saw me, he smiled again. Not the same faint, unnerving smile from before. This one was wider, stretching almost unnaturally across his face. It was so wide that it seemed to distort his features, making him look more like a caricature than a human being. My pulse quickened as I looked around, hoping someone else would notice him, too. But just like the day before, everyone else was oblivious. They walked past him without a second thought, absorbed in their own world. But I couldn't stop staring. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, until I heard the sound of the bus coming. I turned to board, my eyes lingering for a moment longer on the man. And then, he did something strange. He lifted one hand and waved at me. A slow, deliberate motion that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The bus doors opened, and I stepped inside, the air inside feeling warmer, but no less suffocating. As the bus pulled away from the stop, I glanced back out the window. The man was gone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined everything. The smile. The wave. Maybe I'd been too tired, too distracted by the stress of the day. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right about him. And as I watched the streetlights flicker and the gray sky hover like a heavy curtain above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. By Wednesday, I was starting to doubt my sanity. I had told myself it was just a coincidence, just some random guy at the bus stop, part of the everyday blur of life in the city. People stood at bus stops all the time, right? I'd probably seen him around before. Maybe he was just a man with a strange smile. It wasn't like the smile had any power over me, right? But I was lying to myself. I didn't sleep well that night, my dreams jagged and broken. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, the way his lips stretched unnaturally, that cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. I kept hearing the sound of his voice, but no words ever formed. It was like a distant whisper that never quite reached my ears, but still tugged at something deep inside. When the morning came, I was exhausted but couldn't help myself. I had to go back to the bus stop. I had to see if he was there again. As the bus pulled up to the corner of Pine and Fifth, I barely registered the familiar stop sign and the hazy early light. My heart was already pounding in my chest. There he was, standing in the same spot, just as he had every day before. Only this time, his smile was even wider, too wide, stretching almost grotesquely from ear to ear. The kind of smile you see on a villain in a bad horror movie, the kind that doesn't belong on a real human face. But he was real. And he was smiling at me. The rest of the commuters moved past him, none of them even glancing his way. I felt the odd sensation of being the only one in the world who could see him. No one else seemed to acknowledge his presence, but I couldn't look away. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for him to make his move. Then something changed. His smile softened, almost as if he were trying to appear friendly, but it only made the situation worse. My stomach churned. It was as if he were trying to manipulate me, draw me in, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something unsettling behind that smile. Something I couldn't put into words. The bus arrived, and I quickly climbed aboard, hoping to distance myself from the image of his face. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't help but glance back one last time. He was still there. Still smiling. The following days blended together, the days stretching longer as I became more obsessed. I wasn't sure when it started, but something began to change. The smile had gone from being merely uncomfortable to downright disturbing. I couldn't focus on anything else. I would wake up earlier just to make sure I was at the bus stop before he arrived. Every morning, the same eerie routine played out. He was there, standing, smiling, waiting. It wasn't just his smile that disturbed me now. It was the way his eyes followed me, like he knew something I didn't. The unease I had initially felt had deepened into a crawling sensation in my chest, like something was slowly tightening its grip around my heart. I tried to talk to people about him, casually, at first, as if I was just another commuter with a random observation. But every time I mentioned the man, they would look at me like I had lost my mind. No one else is there, man, my friend Bill told me one morning when I mentioned it. You're probably just tired. The morning fog can play tricks on your mind. But it didn't feel like a trick. It felt real. He was real. I began to notice something else, something even stranger. On the days when I didn't see him at the bus stop, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't that I missed him, I didn't, but when he wasn't there, it was as though something was wrong. Like I'd forgotten to check for something important, something I couldn't quite name. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when I didn't see him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile again. It was Thursday when things took a sharp turn. I woke up late that morning, the sunlight already spilling through the curtains. The clock on the nightstand read 7:25. Panic set in, and I scrambled to get dressed, throwing on whatever clothes I could find. My pulse raced as I grabbed my bag and ran out the door. I needed to catch the 7:30 bus, or else I'd be late for work. But as I rushed to the bus stop, something felt wrong. The air was too still. The usual sounds of traffic, people talking, the hum of the city, it was all gone. I stood at the bus stop, waiting for the bus, and then I saw him. The man. But he wasn't standing on the corner like he usually did. He was directly in front of me, so close I could smell his stale breath, hear the scraping of his shoes against the pavement as he shifted. He was grinning wider than ever, and the smile looked almost painful now, as if it was stretching him beyond what was natural. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. The bus hadn't even arrived yet. But something had. Something strange. On the ground beneath my feet was a painting. It was the exact same painting I had seen in my dream the night before, a twisted, abstract representation of the smiling man himself. His face stretched and warped, a grotesque distortion that seemed to bleed from the canvas itself. I froze. The man's grin grew even wider, his eyes twinkling as he stared down at the painting and then back at me. I reached down and touched the canvas. The paint was still wet, the colors vibrant but unsettling, like they were alive. It was then that I noticed something even more terrifying. The paint was still fresh. I hadn't painted it. I hadn't done anything. And yet, the painting was there. I looked up to ask the man, to demand an explanation, but he was gone. Just as quickly as he had appeared, he had disappeared, as if the world had swallowed him whole. The bus pulled up, and I climbed on, shaken. My hands were still trembling, my head spinning. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The bus stop was empty. The painting was gone. There was nothing there. The rest of the day was a blur. I went through the motions, commuting, working, eating, but my mind was consumed with the morning's events. What had happened at the bus stop? Had it really happened? I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Who would understand that a painting had appeared out of nowhere, created by something or someone that I couldn't even comprehend? I spent hours pacing around my apartment after work, my eyes glued to the walls. No paintings. No strange figures lurking in the shadows. Just the same empty, dull walls I'd always had. But the dread had settled in, a deep, suffocating weight that pressed on my chest. I had to find answers. I opened my sketch pad, something I hadn't done in weeks. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to draw for pleasure, but the desire to release whatever was inside me was overwhelming. My hand moved instinctively across the page, sketching lines and shapes that felt almost familiar, as if my hand was guided by something else. And then, without warning, my pencil slipped. A horrifying image started to take form, a man with a grotesque smile stretching wide across his face. His eyes were dark, his skin pale. He stood in the shadows, grinning at me just as he had that morning. I couldn't stop drawing. My hand moved against my will, sketching every detail as if it was an extension of my own thoughts. I had no control over it. I had no choice. The image on the page mirrored the painting I had seen at the bus stop, every detail exactly as it had appeared. But this time, there was something different, something worse. The figure in the drawing seemed to move, its eyes following my gaze as if it were aware of me. It was real. The man was real. I tore the page from the sketch pad and crumpled it up, throwing it into the trash. But as I did, the edges of the paper curled, and the figure on the drawing shifted, the smile growing wider, stretching unnaturally across the page. I recoiled, but it was already too late. I could feel the dread creeping in again, like the shadows were closing in around me. I couldn't escape it. I needed to sleep, but I knew it wouldn't help. I knew what would happen when I closed my eyes. Another painting. That night, the dreams returned. This time, they were different. More vivid. More real. I was standing at the bus stop again, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I could see the smiling man standing there, waiting for me as always, but tonight, something was wrong. The world around me felt distorted, like the edges of reality were peeling away. I tried to walk away, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, and the smile on the man's face grew wider, too wide, grotesque, stretching further than a human face could bear. And then, I saw it. The painting. The same one from that morning. But this time, it wasn't just a painting. It was alive. I could hear the brush strokes, the wet paint scraping against the canvas. The colors bled and shifted, moving as if they had a life of their own. The man's grin seemed to ripple across the canvas, pulsating, as if he was laughing at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my sanity slipping. His gaze was like a hook, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. The world around me started to crumble. The buildings, the street, the sky, it all dissolved into darkness, leaving only the man and his smile. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. My heart hammered in my chest. Sweat soaked through my shirt, my body trembling. The dream felt so real, so vivid. I could still hear that voice, the whispers, the laughter. I could still see the man's face, the way his eyes gleamed with malicious delight. But when I opened my eyes, I was back in my room. Safe, I told myself. I was safe. At least, I wanted to believe that. I stumbled out of bed and walked into the living room, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. But as I flicked on the light, my breath caught in my throat. On the wall across from me was a new painting. The same one. The man stood there, his smile stretching wider than ever, and his eyes were looking directly at me, just like they had in my dream. The paint was still fresh, still wet, the colors dark and swirling like a vortex. I froze. I didn't know how it had gotten there. I didn't know how it was possible. But it was real. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. I thought I was losing my mind. I couldn't escape him. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life. I told myself the paintings were real. I convinced myself that I was hallucinating, that I was just stressed, that I needed to sleep, to take a break. But the man's smile never stopped haunting me. I saw it in every reflection, In every shadow, every corner I turned. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like his eyes were following me. I stopped going to work. I couldn't bring myself to face the world, to face the smiling man. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed locked in my apartment, staring at the walls, the paintings. I had to stop drawing. I couldn't let my hand move. But it didn't matter. The images kept coming, sketched, painted, even carved into the furniture. Every time I closed my eyes, every time I slept, the man was there. And then came the night when it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. My breath came in ragged gasps. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The silence in the room was suffocating. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, just a flash at first, but then it was clear. The man was standing at the foot of my bed. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. His grin was wider than it had ever been before, stretching across his face like it was going to split his skin. And his eyes were filled with something far darker than malice. They were filled with hunger. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body felt like it was paralyzed, as if the very air in the room was pushing down on me. His grin stretched further, and the silence deepened, making my heart beat louder, faster, like it was trying to escape. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel them crawling under my skin. His mouth didn't just move when he spoke, it seemed to distort, to stretch unnaturally. It was as though his very face was being torn apart by the smile, and the sound that came from him wasn't a voice, not really. It was more of a whisper, a rasping, hollow sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You know what I want," he said. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was trembling, my mind racing with panic, but the nightmare felt so real, so terribly real, that I couldn't tell where it ended and where my waking world began. His voice was so close, I could feel it reverberating in my chest, each syllable dragging me deeper into the suffocating atmosphere of terror. "You're mine," he whispered. I closed my eyes, trying to force the nightmare away. But when I opened them again, he was still there, standing at the foot of my bed. He hadn't moved, but the room felt different, distorted, like the very air around me was changing, warping. His smile, it wasn't just a smile anymore. It was a grotesque, impossible thing, too wide, too exaggerated, like it had swallowed the rest of his face. I had to escape. I had to wake up. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. His presence was suffocating. His eyes bore into me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls bending inward. The paintings on the walls, the ones I had tried to ignore, they were now alive. They weren't just painted images. They were portals, windows into something far worse than any nightmare. I could hear them whispering to me. "You drew me," they hissed. "You made me real." The words echoed in my mind. They were right. I had drawn him. Every time I painted or sketched, I had fed into whatever nightmare this was. I had brought him to life with my own hand. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. The smile seemed to grow even wider, impossibly wide, stretching across his face like it was about to split him in half. But it wasn't just his face that was changing now. His whole body started to warp and stretch, as if it were made of liquid, bending in unnatural ways. The man, if he could even be called that anymore, was no longer human. He had become something else. Something darker. I realized, then, that there was no escape. I had let him in. I had given him life, and now he was going to claim me. But I couldn't give up. Not without a fight. I strained every muscle in my body, forcing myself to sit up, to rise from the bed. The figure watched me, still smiling, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of uncertainty. Was he afraid? No, that couldn't be. But there was something there, something that didn't belong. I reached for the closest object I could find, a paintbrush, abandoned on the floor from my earlier madness. My hand wrapped around it, and the moment I held it, I felt a surge of energy, or raw, primal power flooding through me. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't just the artist anymore. I was the creator. I stared at the figure before me, my fingers tightening around the brush. The room felt alive now, pulsing with energy. His smile faltered, just for a moment, as if he could feel the shift. But I wasn't going to give him that moment. I wasn't going to let him take me. I raised the brush, staring into the abyss that was his face. "You want me to paint you?" I said, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "Then I'll paint you, but it won't be the way you expect." The figure in front of me seemed to flinch, as though it recognized the challenge in my voice. But it didn't back down. Instead, it stepped forward, its form now shifting and distorting, as though the boundaries between nightmare and reality were beginning to dissolve. It reached out toward me, its long, elongated fingers curling like claws. I wasn't going to let it win. With shaking hands, I dipped the brush into the paint, deep, dark black paint. I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own breath and the quick, frantic strokes of the brush against the canvas. I painted with desperation, each line and curve a scream, a defiance. The smile on the figure's face was still there, still lingering in the air around me, but I pushed forward, creating a new image, one where I had the power. The moment the brush touched the canvas, everything seemed to freeze. The room went still, the figure paused, watching me with something that could only be described as surprise. The paint dripped from the brush as I worked faster, harder. I had to finish it. I had to make the final stroke before it could stop me. With one final, decisive movement, I completed the painting. The figure's smile disappeared. For the first time, I saw it for what it truly was, a hollow, empty thing, a distorted mockery of what had once been human. I dropped the brush, my hand trembling. I couldn't look away from the painting. It stared back at me, still and silent. And then, everything went dark. For the return of the smile. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. The sun was shining, the day was calm, the world seemed as it had always been. But when I looked around, something felt off. My heart skipped a beat. The paintings were gone. The smiling man was gone. But on the wall, there was a new painting, a simple, almost serene image. A self-portrait of me. And in my hands, the brush was still wet with dark paint. I couldn't stop myself from smiling. Story 3. Thomas Shaw never imagined he'd be drawn to a house like the one he found. He was no stranger to real estate deals, His life as a real estate agent had given him access to properties across the city. But the house on Raven Hill was different. Not because it was grand, nor because it was cheap, it was far from that. The house wasn't a bargain, not by any measure. But something about it, something intangible, had made him want to take a closer look. It was nestled on the outskirts of town, shrouded in an ever-present fog that seemed to settle on it like a curse. The house, a Victorian relic, had stood empty for years, its windows like vacant eyes staring into the empty street. Despite its condition, its peeling paint and the overgrown ivy that clung to the sides like something alive, the structure remained solid. But there was more to it. A pull, a whisper, that urged him to enter. Thomas had heard the rumors about Ravenhill House. No one ever seemed to stay in it for long, and it was often said that those who did either left with their sanity frayed or vanished entirely. But those were just stories, right? Folklore and gossip, all fed to him by people who didn't have the imagination to see the potential in a place like this. And so, with a half-hearted laugh and an even more half-hearted sense of dread, he made the decision. He bought the house. But as he stood in the grand entryway, looking up at the cracked chandelier that hung like an ancient, silent sentinel above him, he felt the first flicker of doubt. Was it regret, or was it just the weight of the house settling on his mind? Either way, something about this place felt wrong. The front door had creaked open with an eerie groan, and as he crossed the threshold, the stale air seemed to close in around him, thick and oppressive. It was as if the house itself were breathing, sucking in the air as though it were alive. He tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to the silence of the house. After all, it had been vacant for years. He moved further into the dimly lit foyer, his footsteps echoing too loudly for comfort. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as if protesting his presence. But it was the walls that captured his attention. It wasn't an overwhelming noise at first, just a murmur, soft and indistinct, like whispers from far away. But as his footfalls echoed into the empty rooms, the whispers seemed to grow louder. Not voices, not words exactly, but something akin to it, soft and undulating, like the hum of something deeply hidden, or perhaps something ancient, living inside the walls. By the time night fell, Thomas was exhausted. He hadn't expected to feel so drained after spending just a few hours walking through the house, but something about it drained him in a way he couldn't explain. His head throbbed as he made his way up the staircase, but he told himself it was just the stress of the move. The second-floor hallway was lined with closed doors, each one leading to a room darker than the last. The only light was from a single lamp at the far end, casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. When he reached the room that was to be his, the whispers began again. At first, he thought it was the wind, the old wood creaking as it settled. But no, this was different. The walls seemed to be alive with sound, murmuring in a low, unintelligible hum that made the air thick and oppressive. The whispers seemed to swirl around him, getting louder and louder until his head felt as if it would explode. He tried to ignore it, but as he lay in bed, the voices continued. They were almost familiar, as though they were speaking his name. Thomas. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from inside his own head. He sat up, his heart pounding, and glanced around the room. The shadows flickered unnervingly, as though they were moving of their own accord. He felt a sharp chill creep down his spine. The house was still, silent, except for that unyielding whisper. It was as if it was alive, aware of his every movement. Thomas. The voice repeated his name, this time louder, almost a command. He rose from the bed and walked to the window, expecting to see the familiar street below, but the fog had thickened. The entire street, the entire world outside, seemed to have vanished into a thick, impenetrable void. There was nothing but darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw something. A figure, just standing there in the middle of the street, staring up at him. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. Thomas blinked, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. Vanished. The whispering stopped, but the air remained thick with it, pressing in on him. He knew it was coming from the house. From the walls. But why was it speaking to him? And more troubling, what did it want? As the days passed, the whispers grew more pronounced. Thomas could no longer deny it. He wasn't just hearing things. The house, Raven Hill, was speaking to him. Each room seemed to have its own voice, its own regrets, its own history. At times, the whispers were so distinct that he could almost make out individual words, his name, his past mistakes, the things he wished he could forget. It was driving him mad. He tried to ignore it, throwing himself into the renovation of the house, but the whispers wouldn't let up. It wasn't until the third night that they began to reveal themselves in full. He sat up in bed, unable to sleep, his eyes locked on the ceiling as the house seemed to pulse with energy. The murmurs shifted, becoming more deliberate, more insistent. "I know what you did," the walls whispered. Thomas shuddered and pulled the covers over his head, trying to block out the noise. But the words were clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. They were speaking to him now, not just through the walls, but directly to him in a language he couldn't comprehend. They knew his past. They knew his regrets. "I know what you did," they repeated. Suddenly, a cold gust of air blew through the room, rattling the windows. His heart raced as he pulled the covers tighter around himself. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to know. But deep down, he knew the house wasn't just whispering, it was remembering. Remembering the mistakes he had buried so deep. Mistakes he thought he had forgotten. And now, it was reminding him. Thomas awoke the next morning with a dull, throbbing headache. He had barely slept a wink. The air felt thicker than it had the night before, as though the house itself were pressing down on him, demanding attention. He tried to shake off the remnants of the whispering voices, but they clung to him like a bad memory, following him wherever he went. He made his way to the kitchen, his bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floors. The house was silent now, eerily so. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that the events of the previous night were nothing more than a bad dream. But as he opened the refrigerator, his reflection in the darkened window caught his eye. The face staring back at him was pale and gaunt, a shadow of the man who had stepped into this house only days ago. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes were wide, as though he hadn't slept in weeks. He looked hollow. The silence of the house enveloped him again. The stillness was unsettling. It was too quiet, too unnatural. The house had a life of its own. He could feel it watching him, listening. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for work. He had to get out of this house. He needed to clear his head, get away from whatever was haunting him. But as he reached for his coat, he felt it again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable, curling around his thoughts. "I know what you did." The words sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just in his head this time. The walls, the air, everything around him seemed to breathe with those words. The regret was inescapable. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he thought he might be sick. But he had to go. He couldn't stay here, not with the house pressing on him, not with the weight of those words hanging over his head. He left in a hurry, slamming the door behind him, but as he stepped onto the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He looked around, half expecting to see the same figure he had seen the night before, standing in the distance. But there was no one there. The fog had cleared slightly, but the chill remained. He hurried to his car, hoping to leave the house behind for at least a few hours. When he returned to the house that evening, the silence was oppressive. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the sound of other people, of life outside this place. It felt like he had been living in a vacuum, suffocating in the weight of his own isolation. And yet, as he stepped inside, the familiar whisper greeted him once more. "I know what you did." Thomas froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. No one to blame for the voice except himself. It was as though the house had become an extension of his mind, a place that knew all his deepest fears and darkest memories. He stood in the hallway, unable to move. The air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the past, his past. He thought about leaving again, about running away from the house, from the whispers. But he knew, deep down, that it would be futile. The house had already taken root in his mind. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder the whispers became. They weren't just haunting him anymore, they were digging into his thoughts, pulling out his buried regrets, his shame, his mistakes. Without thinking, he began to walk through the house, his footsteps heavy as he passed each door. Each room seemed to hum with the same energy, the same sinister life force. But as he passed the parlor, something caught his attention. A painting. It wasn't there before. He stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The painting was simple, just a landscape of trees, a fog rolling over the ground. But it was the way the light seemed to catch it, the way the shadows played on the surface, that made his skin crawl. The edges of the painting were frayed, as though it had been hanging there for years, forgotten. But Thomas knew it wasn't there before. The whispering began again, this time louder. "You should have chosen differently." It was a voice from his past. He couldn't place it, but it was unmistakable, like a voice from an old friend, a memory he had locked away. The voice was calm, matter of fact, and yet it carried a weight that seemed to settle in his chest, pressing him down. He reached for the painting, unable to stop himself. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a rush of images flooded his mind, flashes of his past, things he had done, things he had forgotten. His father's death. The lies he told to his wife. The betrayal. The regret. And then, as quickly as it had come, the rush stopped. The painting was silent again, and the whisper faded into the walls. But the weight of it lingered. The next morning, Thomas couldn't escape the feeling that the house had changed. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, it was the way the walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive, waiting for him to make a mistake. He sat in the living room, his hands trembling as he tried to focus on his work. But the silence, the oppressive silence, gnawed at him. The more he tried to concentrate, the more the whispers intensified. "You should have listened." The voice was unmistakable. His own voice. Thomas leaped to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never heard himself speak like that before, not in this way. His voice was distant, detached, like someone else was speaking through him. He stumbled toward the door, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to escape this house, this nightmare. But just as his hand touched the doorknob, the whisper came again, so loud it rattled the walls. "I know what you did." And this time, the house shook. The walls groaned in protest, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very foundation itself. The air thickened, pressing against him like a weight he couldn't escape. It was as though the house was trying to tell him something terrible. Something he wasn't ready to hear. The sound of the house grew louder, the whispers overwhelming. It was no longer just his past mistakes, it was his future, too. The house wasn't just reminding him of what he had done, it was showing him what was to come. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, deeper. They stretched out, reaching for him, pulling him back into the house's grip. Thomas felt the panic rise in his chest as he backed away from the door. He had to leave, he had to get out before it was too late. But it was already too late. The house had claimed him. Thomas couldn't bring himself to leave. Every time he tried to step outside to escape the house, something stopped him. It wasn't a physical barrier, it was something far more insidious. His feet felt heavy, as if invisible hands were holding him in place. The house had a grip on him, something deeper than any physical force. That night, the whispers were louder than ever before. They seemed to come from every direction, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the air itself. The voices were becoming impossible to ignore, pressing in on him, suffocating him with regret. "I know what you did." The words echoed through the rooms, more insistent, more urgent. Thomas clutched his head in his hands, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. It was as if the house itself had become a reflection of his mind, mirroring his every fear, his every mistake. He sank to his knees, his breathing ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The house had become a living, breathing thing, alive with his guilt, his failures. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching long and twisted, like hands reaching for him. In the corner of his eye, something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest, seemed to slither along the walls. It darted from one limb to the next, always out of sight but always present. Thomas tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something waiting. And then he heard it, a soft, unmistakable sound, the sound of someone whispering his name. Thomas. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was not his own. It was unfamiliar, low, almost like a breath, like something that didn't belong in this world. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, swirling in the corners of the room. They pressed in on him, suffocating him with their presence. The whispering intensified, the walls vibrating with the sound of his past, of his regrets. "I know what you did." The voice came again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. The walls of the house groaned, creaking as if they were alive, as if they were about to collapse in on themselves. Thomas tried to stand, to move, but his body felt like lead. He was trapped in the house, trapped in his own mind. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, his vision blurring as the shadows closed in around him. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, and for the first time, Thomas truly believed it. Thomas awoke with a start, his chest heaving, sweat coating his skin. He was lying on the floor of the living room, the same spot where he had collapsed. The house was silent again, but it was an unsettling silence, the calm before the storm. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of the house's presence still pressed down on him, suffocating him. He struggled to his feet, his body aching from the fall. The air felt thick, charged with something he couldn't explain. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house was no longer just a house. It was more than that. It was a mirror, reflecting his darkest fears, his deepest regrets. It knew him better than he knew himself. As he walked through the house, he noticed something new. The walls, once plain and unremarkable, now seemed to shimmer with something darker. The shadows clung to them, crawling along the edges like something alive, something waiting. Thomas stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway, his own reflection staring back at him, but there was something wrong with it. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he were a stranger in his own skin. And then, in the reflection, he saw it, the figure standing behind him. The man. The same man who had appeared to him the night before, the one who had whispered in his ear. He was standing behind Thomas in the mirror, grinning that same twisted smile, his eyes dark and empty. The figure's lips moved, but Thomas couldn't hear what he was saying. The whispers had drowned him out. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. The same empty house. Thomas backed away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stumbled backward, as if the house itself was trying to swallow him whole. The whispers began again. "You can't run from your past." Thomas could no longer tell where the house ended and his mind began. It was as if the two had fused, becoming one and the same. His every step felt like a violation, each creak of the floorboards a reminder that he was trapped, ensnared by the very walls that had once offered him refuge. The house had become a prison, and the regrets it whispered to him were his chains. He tried to leave, tried to pack his bags and escape, but every time he reached the door, the air grew thick with dread. The whispers would return, louder and more insistent, filling his head with memories he didn't want to face. "I know what you did." The voice was no longer just a whisper, it was a roar, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all accusing him of his past mistakes. He couldn't escape them. They were in the walls, in the floors, in the very air he breathed. The house had become a living nightmare, and Thomas was trapped inside it. He sat in the middle of the living room, his hands shaking as he clutched his head, trying to block out the voices. But the harder he tried, the louder they became. "You can't escape," the voice hissed. "You can't run from your past." And then, as if to punctuate the words, the house groaned. The walls cracked and creaked, and the very foundation of the house seemed to shift. Thomas could feel it, feel the house moving, breathing, pulsing around him. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. The man was standing in the doorway. The same man. The man with the twisted smile. Thomas screamed. Thomas was paralyzed with fear, his heart thumping painfully in his chest as the man in the doorway took a step closer. His smile remained wide and unnatural, stretching far too much, showing far too many teeth. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce straight through him, draining him of any remnants of courage. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Thomas could barely breathe, his body refusing to obey him. The figure in front of him didn't move, it just stood there, its gaze fixed upon him, and in that gaze, there was something profoundly wrong. The room seemed to close in, the walls pushing toward him like the hand of some unseen force, squeezing the life from him. "Do you remember?" The voice was a rasp, an almost inaudible whisper that dripped with malice. It came from the man's lips, but it wasn't his voice. It was something older, something darker, and it filled the room with its presence. Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. He had to escape. He had to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind was a tangled mess of confusion and fear. His thoughts were spiraling out of control. What did the man mean? What did he remember? "I know what you did." It was the same voice, the same words that had been following him since the very first night. The words that had driven him to madness. The house had been speaking to him, whispering his past mistakes, his regrets. But this man, this figure standing before him, was no longer just a part of the house's twisted whispers. He was the face of his own guilt. The manifestation of everything Thomas had ever done wrong. The man took another step closer, and Thomas staggered backward, tripping over his own feet and falling hard to the floor. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any escape, but the house was closing in on him. There was nowhere left to run. "You can't escape," the man said again, his smile never faltering. "The house knows everything. It knows what you've done. It knows what you didn't do." Thomas's mind reeled. The house, how could it possibly know? How could it know things that had never been spoken aloud? Things that no one else could know? The memories flooded in. The man stepped closer, and now Thomas could see the details of his face more clearly. The smile was no longer just a grotesque distortion, it was a mocking, triumphant grin, as if the figure was enjoying his suffering. "You made your choices, Thomas. Don't you remember?" The voice was soft, but it cut through him like a knife. And then, with a jolt of horror, the truth came rushing back. The guilt. The pain. The decision that had haunted him for years, the one he had buried deep inside himself, hoping it would stay forgotten. It was a choice that had torn his life apart. And now, in the cold light of this dreadful revelation, he couldn't hide from it any longer. Thomas had never wanted to hurt anyone. He had never meant for things to turn out the way they had, but in that moment, when it had mattered most, he had turned away. He had abandoned the person who needed him the most, and he had allowed them to suffer in ways that he would never be able to undo. The guilt was suffocating, crushing him with the weight of everything he had done, or rather, everything he hadn't done. The house hadn't been tormenting him with whispers about things he had forgotten. It had been tormenting him with the truth that he had buried so deep, he couldn't even acknowledge it until now. He hadn't just bought a house. He had bought a house that was a mirror of his own soul. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a stranger. He was the reflection of Thomas's own darkness, the embodiment of everything he had tried to escape. The house had known. It had always known. "You're not alone in here, Thomas," the man said, his smile widening even further, as if he reveled in the anguish he was causing. "You never have been." The walls of the house groaned again, and this time Thomas could hear something beneath the sounds. It was a soft, almost imperceptible noise at first, like a scratching, a scraping sound, like something being pulled from the inside. And then it became louder, more frantic, as if something was crawling toward him. The figure took another step forward, and this time Thomas could see the shadowy outline of the man's true form. His skin was a sickly gray, his face gaunt and twisted, eyes burning with a malice that sent shivers down Thomas's spine. He looked less like a person and more like an echo of something long forgotten. The whispers intensified. They weren't coming from the walls anymore, they were coming from everywhere. The floors, the ceiling, the air itself. They were inescapable. They drowned out everything else. You can't hide from your mistakes, the voice said again, this time louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was closing in on Thomas, consuming him. The house is alive, Thomas. It feeds on your regrets. It feeds on your guilt. And it will never let you go. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living thing, a creature that fed off his darkness, off his pain. It had been waiting for him to open the door, to step inside, to let it in. And now, it had him. You're mine, the voice whispered, and with it, the house seemed to shake. The floor beneath Thomas's feet cracked, and the walls twisted, their surface rippling like liquid. The figure, the man, reached out a skeletal hand, and with it, the house itself seemed to respond. The shadows twisted around Thomas, pulling at him, dragging him deeper into the house's darkness. And then, in that moment, as the shadows consumed him, Thomas understood. There was no escape. The house had never been about the physical space, it had always been about him. It had always been about the choices he made, the regrets that festered inside of him. It had taken those regrets and turned them into something living, something powerful. And now, it would never let him go. For the last whisper. The last thing Thomas heard was the whisper. You'll never forget. And with that, the house closed in around him completely. The house that whispers regrets had claimed another soul. Story 4. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun barely touches the edges of the clouds, leaving a pale wash over the city. In the small barber shop, the scent of aftershave and hair tonic hung thick in the air, mingling with the sound of snipping scissors and buzzing clippers. Tom Donnelly, the shop's owner, adjusted the black apron around his waist, ready for another day of haircuts and idle chatter with the usual crowd of customers. But that morning, something felt different. The door opened, jangling the bell above it. A man stepped in, his appearance drawing Tom's immediate attention. He was tall, thin, with a gaunt face, and his features were sharp, almost too sharp. His eyes were dark, almost sunken, and his hair, though combed neatly, had a kind of unnatural stillness to it, as if it didn't belong to him at all. He wore an old coat, the collar turned up against the cold, and despite the warm spring morning, he looked out of place, like he had walked out of another time. Morning, the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Morning, sir. How can I help you today? Tom replied, his tone polite but distracted. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the man was not quite right. I need a trim, the man said, his eyes scanning the room briefly, as if he was looking for something. Sure thing, Tom said, motioning to the chair. Take a seat. The man obeyed, his movements deliberate and stiff. Tom set the cape around his neck, and as he did, his eyes flicked toward the large mirror in front of the man. The reflection should have been there, a perfect echo of the man sitting before him, but instead, there was nothing, no reflection at all. Tom blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He glanced again. Nothing. The man's face remained expressionless, as though he hadn't noticed. Or perhaps he hadn't cared. "Everything all right?" Tom asked, trying to mask his confusion. "You okay in there?" The man nodded, the edges of his lips curling slightly as though he was amused. "I'm fine. Just busy, you know?" Tom chuckled nervously, but his hands faltered as he reached for the clippers. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There was something inherently off about the man, something that gnawed at Tom's gut. The barber set the clippers to the man's hair, the buzz filling the air, but his mind lingered on the absence of a reflection. It didn't make sense. Was it a trick of the light? A fault in the mirror? But it was the newest mirror in the shop, installed just 2 weeks ago. Tom could still hear the glassman boasting about the clarity and precision of the piece. And yet, now, it was as if the man wasn't even there. The snip of scissors. The hum of clippers. Time passed, but that strange stillness remained. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, his eyes never once meeting Tom's in the mirror. After a few minutes, Tom finished the trim, his hands now trembling slightly. "All done," he said, trying to sound normal, to shake off the feeling that had settled in his bones. "That'll be $30. The man stood up slowly, his movements still unnervingly deliberate. He paid without saying a word, his eyes never straying from the floor. As Tom wrapped the money in a receipt, he watched the man walk toward the door. The bell above the door rang as the man exited, and Tom glanced once more at the mirror. There was still no reflection. It was impossible. It had to be a trick of his mind, Tom reasoned. Maybe it had been a poor angle, a shadow playing tricks. He couldn't just not see the man. People weren't just not visible. No, it was nonsense. But as the door closed behind the man, the strange unease didn't leave Tom. Instead, it lingered, heavy in the air. Tom stared at the now empty chair, the place where the man had been, but even now, it felt as if he was still there, watching him from the shadows. The quiet was almost suffocating, and for the first time in years, Tom found himself questioning his own sanity. He knew the man had been there, but there was no sign of him in the mirror, no trace of his presence anywhere. The shop seemed smaller now, claustrophobic, as if the air itself was thickening. It was just a fluke, he told himself, as he wiped down the seat and turned off the lights, closing the shop for the day. But the next day, the man came back. Tom had just finished cleaning up, wiping down the last countertop when the doorbell rang. He looked up, and there he was again, tall, gaunt, the same disquieting presence as before. The same feeling surged through Tom's chest, gnawing his insides. This time, however, the man didn't wait for Tom to speak. He walked directly to the chair, sat down, and placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. "Morning," he said, his voice the same soft whisper as the day before. No greeting. No introduction. No acknowledgement. "Morning," Tom replied, his voice tight. He didn't know if he could go through this again, if he could sit in this same silence, this unnerving calm. But he did. He draped the cape around the man's neck again, hands trembling slightly, and as he turned to reach for the clippers, he caught the reflection in the mirror. This time, the man was there. Tom blinked. No, the man wasn't there. His reflection, standing in the exact same spot, was staring at him from the mirror. But the man, the real man, in the chair, didn't move. Didn't blink. He was perfectly still, staring straight ahead, but his reflection was doing something different. The reflection smiled. Tom froze. The real man's expression didn't change, but the one in the mirror, it grinned. A wide, terrible smile that twisted the face in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The smile spread like it was stretching the skin, distorting the face into something unnatural. Is something wrong? The man asked softly, breaking Tom from his stupor. Tom snapped his gaze back to the chair. The man hadn't moved. But the reflection. Nothing, Tom muttered, though his voice was weak. Just strange lighting. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The man in the mirror wasn't him. It wasn't anyone. It was a shadow. A mockery. And it was waiting for Tom to make the next move. For the next few days, Tom found himself in a strange, unshakable routine. The man continued to come in at the same time each morning. Every visit followed the same pattern. He would sit in the chair, pay, and Tom would cut his hair in silence. No words were exchanged beyond the essentials. But what kept Tom on edge wasn't the man's behavior, it was the reflections. Every single time the man sat in the chair, Tom would glance nervously at the mirror. At first, it was just the unsettling smile in the reflection, that wide, unnerving grin that seemed to stretch far beyond natural human capability. But over the course of the week, things began to change. The reflection of the man became more pronounced, more animated. It started with subtle shifts, small tilts of the head, flickers of movement in the corner of Tom's vision, but soon, the changes grew more deliberate. The reflection would blink when the man didn't. It would twitch its fingers. And once, during a particularly quiet session, the reflection even mouthed words that Tom couldn't hear. "What's going on?" Tom whispered to himself, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his hands were shaking too much. His fingers gripped the scissors tightly, clipping in an almost robotic fashion, as if doing the motions without truly engaging with the reality of what was happening. The man didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he was pretending not to. He never looked at Tom. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his words came out slow and deliberate, like a rehearsed monologue. "Everything all right?" Tom asked one day, his voice strained, unsure of what to make of the growing dissonance between the man and his reflection. The man nodded slightly, but this time, Tom didn't hear his voice. It was as if the man's lips had moved, but the sound was absent, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had begun to fill the shop. Tom swallowed hard, trying to ignore the rising anxiety in his chest. He had to keep cutting. He had to focus. But every time he looked into the mirror, it was there, the smile, now grotesque, stretched unnaturally wide. The reflection's eyes weren't just staring anymore, they were following him. Watching him. The man's lips never moved, but the reflection's grin was wide, stretched, and impossible. It was as if the reflection knew something Tom didn't. Something he wasn't supposed to know. By the third day, Tom was beginning to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. His mind was clouded with confusion, exhaustion, and a creeping sense of dread. Sleep had become a rare commodity, and even when he did sleep, the dreams were worse than the waking hours. He would dream of endless mirrors, of reflections that didn't match their originals, of eyes watching him from every surface, every corner. The strange man had stopped coming in at exactly the same time. Tom couldn't tell if it was a coincidence or if the man was somehow toying with him, but it didn't matter. The unease had only deepened. Even when the man was gone, the feeling lingered, like a shadow in the corners of the room or a whisper just out of earshot. But it wasn't until the fourth day that something truly bizarre happened. Tom had just finished cutting the hair of his last customer when the man walked in again. This time, he was different. There was a strange, almost disturbing calm about him, a presence that felt heavier, more tangible than before. The shop, already small and dimly lit, seemed to shrink even further. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, and the mirrors, Tom noticed, no longer reflected the light the way they used to. Everything looked off, like a dream turning slowly into a nightmare. The man stepped toward the chair, and as always, paid without a word. Tom's hand shook, but he managed to force a smile. "Just a trim?" he asked, hoping for some normalcy, for some sign that things were still real. The man didn't respond, but sat silently in the chair, his back perfectly straight, his face vacant. Tom wrapped the cape around him, his hands trembling more than usual. He was too afraid to look at the mirror, but he knew it was inevitable. This time, when Tom glanced at the reflection, his stomach dropped. The man was gone. The chair was empty. There was no sign of him. Yet, Tom knew the man hadn't moved. His seat was still warm, the air still thick with his strange presence. But when Tom turned to the mirror, there was nothing. The reflection showed nothing but the empty chair, a blank space where the man had once been. Tom's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the mirror. It was cold to the touch, like glass. Solid. Real. But the reflection, there was nothing. No sign of the man. Where? Tom muttered to himself, panic rising in his chest. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he turned to look at the chair again. The man was still sitting there. His eyes were vacant, his lips curled into that unsettling smile. But now the reflection was mocking him. It was showing nothing. The man was right there, yet his reflection had completely vanished. Tom staggered back, his mind reeling. He had to get out of here. He had to leave, but his legs refused to move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor, unable to escape the nightmare unfolding before him. The room was suffocating. The air thick, stale. Even the light, dim as it was, seemed to cast shadows that warped and twisted unnaturally. The man's smile grew wider, stretching further until it seemed impossible, until it looked like it would tear his face apart. Tom's breath quickened. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, though he knew he was alone. The man didn't answer. He never answered. Tom turned away from the chair, his heart racing as his mind spun faster and faster, trying to piece together what was happening. There was something about the mirrors. Something about the man. Something about the way reality itself was starting to twist and bend. Tom knew, deep down, that the reflection was more than a trick of the light. It wasn't just a mirror that was broken. It was him. There was no escape. No way out. No matter what he did, no matter how many times he looked away or turned back, the reflection wouldn't leave. It was there, haunting him, mocking him, waiting. The barber's shop had become a prison. And Tom knew it wasn't the man who was lost. It was him. The days blurred together. Tom could no longer tell where one day ended and the next began. He was losing track of time, losing himself in the labyrinth of mirrors and the ever-present man. His thoughts had become fragmented, a fractured collage of disturbing images, half-heard whispers, and the man's haunting grin. It seemed to consume him, devour every ounce of his sanity bit by bit. It wasn't just the man anymore. It was the mirrors. Tom couldn't escape them. The walls of the shop, once familiar, now seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Every surface seemed to reflect not just his image, but his inner turmoil. He would find himself standing before a mirror, staring into it, lost in the swirling darkness of his own thoughts. The glass would reflect his face, but never entirely. His features would shift and warp, contort in ways that didn't seem possible, like a funhouse mirror come to life. He began to question what was real. Was the man ever there? Or had he simply imagined him? Had the whole thing been some kind of fevered dream? The mirrors, the whispers, the strange, oppressive weight that had settled into the shop, it was all too much. Tom's mind was unraveling, like an old sweater coming undone thread by thread. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself, but the voice that answered wasn't his own. "It's not your fault," the voice whispered from the dark corner of his mind. "You're just paying for your sins." Tom's hand shot to his ears, as though trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder. The whispers were everywhere now, rising from the mirrors, crawling up the walls, snaking around his neck like invisible hands. It wasn't just the man anymore. The whole shop was alive, a living, breathing entity, feeding on his fear, feeding on his regret. "Stop it," Tom whimpered, retreating to the corner of the room. "Just stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, swirling into a maddening crescendo. His breath came in shallow gasps. He closed his eyes, hoping the nightmare would end, but when he opened them again, the reflection was there. Not in the mirror, but right in front of him. The man stood, inches away, his wide smile stretching impossibly across his face. His eyes were empty, soulless. But that smile, that grin, was worse than anything Tom had ever seen. It was the grin of something otherworldly, something malevolent. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Tom stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the doors were locked. The mirrors, those cursed mirrors, wouldn't let him go. The man's smile widened. His eyes never left Tom's, and the reflection grew stronger, more solid, until it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a part of him. A piece of his own soul twisted and warped. "What do you want from me?" Tom gasped, his voice trembling. "What is this?" The man didn't answer. But the reflection did. "You were always meant to be here, the reflection whispered, its voice a low, guttural sound. It was the voice of 1,000 regrets, of countless sins. You've been running from it your whole life. But now, you're trapped. Tom shook his head, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. He was suffocating in the very air around him. The mirrors pressed in, their glass surfaces now slick with condensation, their reflections twisted and fractured. Every surface was a portal into some other reality, some other world. And they all led to the same place, the same terrible truth. It wasn't the man who had haunted him. It was Tom. He had always been the one trapped. He had always been the one running from his past, from his mistakes, from the things he couldn't undo. He had spent his life trying to outrun the darkness inside him, but now it had caught up with him. And there was no escape. The reflection in the mirror began to change. The smile faded, replaced by something far worse, guilt, remorse, regret. The reflection grew older, gaunt, its features ravaged by time. But it was still Tom. Still him. You did this, the reflection whispered. You let me in. You let me take over. Tom's breath caught in his throat. No, I didn't, he said, but the words were hollow, meaningless. The reflection had already consumed him. Time stretched. The world around him seemed to bend and warp as the shop became something else entirely. It was no longer a barber's shop. It was a prison. The mirrors, the walls, the chairs, everything was alive, everything was watching. And Tom, unable to escape, was a prisoner of his own guilt. The man in the chair, the reflection, no longer had a face. It was just a blur of shadows and shapes. Tom could feel his own reflection pulling away, growing distant, like it was slipping through his fingers, slipping into the cracks of his own fractured mind. But it was too late. Tom fell to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, but the whispers wouldn't stop. The man, the reflection, was still there, still watching, still smiling that sick, twisted smile. The glass that had once been so solid now rippled like water, and the face staring back at him was no longer his own. It was a grotesque version of himself, distorted, monstrous. The grin stretched impossibly wide. No! Tom screamed, but it was a hollow cry, swallowed by the silence of the shop. The reflection reached out, its hand stretching through the glass, grabbing Tom's face, pulling him closer to the mirror. The glass began to warp around him, curling into a vortex, sucking him in, dragging him into its depths. And as Tom was pulled into the mirror, his final thought was one of terror, one of overwhelming regret. I've lost everything. Tom's mind spun in a whirl of confusion and terror as he fell through the mirror, tumbling into an abyss of glass and shadows. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, being pulled into something cold, slick, and endless. The world he knew, the world outside the barber shop, seemed like a distant memory, slipping away like a dream he could no longer remember. When he landed, it wasn't on the floor of the shop, but in a vast, empty space, surrounded by endless mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of him, some smiling, some with their faces twisted in agony, others with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. There was no light, no warmth, only the soft, rhythmic hum of the mirrors vibrating in the silence. It was as though the mirrors themselves were alive, breathing, whispering in a language Tom couldn't understand. He stood in the center of this empty void, his hands trembling at his sides. His reflection, no, the reflection, was there, but it wasn't his. It was something else. Something that had never existed in the world he knew. It had grown from a faint whisper in the corner of his mind to something far more powerful, something that had taken on a life of its own. A life that was now his prison. A voice, deep and hollow, echoed through the space, reverberating off the mirrors. "Welcome home," it said. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he whirled around. The man, the reflection, was standing in one of the mirrors, staring at him with those soulless eyes, the grin stretched wide. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was the truth. The truth he had been running from for so long. "You can't escape," the voice continued, 1,000 whispers now converging into a single, unified sound. "You've always been here. Always will be." The mirrors around Tom began to shift, twisting and bending, each one showing him a different moment of his life. He saw his childhood, his carefree days, his first love, his first mistake. The reflection was always there, lurking in the background, a shadow on the edge of his consciousness. But as the mirrors continued to move, the images became darker. He saw the moment he had pushed away his best friend, the argument that had torn their relationship apart. He saw his mother's face as she lay dying, her eyes filled with unspoken sorrow. He saw the choices he had made, the selfish decisions, the lies, the betrayals. Each reflection became more distorted, more monstrous. The man, no, the reflection, was there, always watching, always waiting. The face of guilt, of regret, of everything Tom had tried to bury. His past, his mistakes, they were all here, in the mirrors, staring back at him with hollow eyes. "No!" Tom shouted, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of whispers. "I didn't mean to." The reflection's smile widened, its face now unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of humanity. "You can't run anymore, Tom. You can't hide from what you've done." His knees buckled, and he fell to the cold ground, clutching his head in his hands. The voices were deafening now, the mirrors pressing in around him. He could feel the glass biting into his skin, like thousands of tiny needles piercing his flesh. "It's your fault," the voice whispered again. "You never learned. You never understood." Tom looked around, desperate for a way out, but the mirrors were everywhere. They were the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They reflected every part of him, every mistake, every regret. He was drowning in himself, in his own failures. In one of the mirrors, he saw a new reflection, a younger version of himself, standing by his side. But this version was different. It had no eyes. Its face was blank, hollow. Tom reached out, but the reflection stepped back, its face distorting into a mask of pure agony. Tom's heart raced. The reflection was him, but it wasn't. It was everything he had tried to forget. The child who had been abandoned, the boy who had failed to protect the ones he loved, the man who had never taken responsibility for his actions. "You think you can fix it," the reflection said, its voice now like a growl. "You can't. You'll never escape what's inside you." Tom stood up, shaking, his mind screaming at him to find a way out. But the mirrors closed in, tighter and tighter. The whispers, the reflections, they were all a part of him, all trapped within this world of glass. He had no choice. There was no escape. He was already lost. But then, a single, desperate thought, flashed through his mind. He had been running from this place his whole life. Running from his mistakes, his regrets, his past. But now, in this place of endless reflections, he couldn't run anymore. He had to face it. Tom closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The moment his foot touched the surface of the nearest mirror, the world exploded in a burst of light. The mirror shattered, falling like shards of glass to the ground, but Tom didn't stop. He kept walking, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. And with each step, the weight on his chest grew lighter. He felt the guilt, the shame, the regret all start to slip away, like water draining from a sinking ship. The mirrors were gone. The whispers faded into silence. And for the first time in a long time, Tom could breathe. But then he stopped. The smile. The man. It was still there, reflected in the shattered glass around him. It was staring at him, waiting. "You'll never be free," it whispered, its grin stretching wider than ever before. And Tom knew, deep in his soul, that it was right. Silence around him was palpable. There was no rustling wind, no chirping of crickets. Just the faint hum of his car's engine as it broke through the suffocating quiet. Ashcroft didn't look much different from any other sleepy town, but the deeper he drove, the more it became clear that something was wrong. The houses lined the streets, withered and old, their windows dark, their gardens overgrown with wild grass. But there was no sign of life. No cars parked in driveways. No children playing in the yards. No dogs barking. Jack pulled up to a small inn on the edge of town. The sign, the Oak View Inn, swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking under its own weight. He parked the car and grabbed his bag from the passenger seat, glancing nervously at the empty streets before heading inside. The door creaked open, and Jack was greeted by a strange, pervasive stillness. A woman stood behind the counter, her back turned to him. She was small and delicate, with gray hair tied neatly in a bun. She didn't speak when Jack entered, but he noticed her stiff posture. It was as though she had been waiting for him, waiting for someone. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, almost too soft, as if she were speaking from the edge of a dream. Jack hesitated, unsettled by her stillness. "Yeah, I'm looking for a room for the night." The woman nodded, turning slowly to grab the key from a hook behind her. "We have a room available," she said, her voice trailing off. "It's the last one." Jack took the key, nodding, but before he could ask any further questions, the woman had already turned away. Her back remained to him as she walked slowly toward the stairs, her feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He stood there for a moment, his heart beating faster than it should have. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. But what was it? 1.2 The unspoken. Jack's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his way to the room. The door creaked when he opened it, and the air inside smelled musty, as though the room hadn't been aired in years. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. It was a typical room, nothing fancy, but there was something about it that made Jack uneasy. The silence was thick, suffocating, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Jack set his bag down on the bed and went to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to peek outside. The fog had settled deeper into the streets, and there was no movement to be seen. Not a single light flickered in the distance. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was just a quiet town. Nothing to worry about. Yet, as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from beyond the glass. The sound of a faint knock startled him. He turned quickly, but there was no one at the door. The hall outside was empty, the silence returning once again. Jack furrowed his brow and opened the door, looking up and down the hallway. Nothing. He shook his head and closed the door, brushing off the odd occurrence. As he walked back to the bed, something caught his eye, a small piece of paper folded neatly on the nightstand. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The note was handwritten in a cramped, uneven script. Don't listen to the silence. A chill ran down Jack's spine as he held the note, his pulse quickening. Who had left this here? Why? His eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the curtains or the closet door. The silence seemed to grow deeper around him, pressing in from all sides. Unable to ignore the nagging feeling any longer, Jack decided to leave the room and explore the town a little. He wasn't sure why he felt this strange urgency, but he couldn't just sit in that room, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The door to the inn creaked again as Jack stepped into the hallway. The light outside had dimmed, the fog pressing against the windows. He could hear nothing, no sounds of life, no footsteps, no voices. He ventured down the stairs and into the town square, which lay just outside the inn. The small town was eerily empty, but he could see figures moving in the distance. People walking, their faces frozen in neutral expressions, their eyes downcast, and their movements stiff, like marionettes with their strings pulled taut. It was an unsettling sight, but it was the silence that truly disturbed him. Jack took a few steps toward the center of the square, but no one acknowledged him. No nods, no glances, not even a flicker of recognition. It was as though he had become invisible to them. He approached a man standing by a lamppost, hoping for some sort of interaction. He tapped the man on the shoulder, but when the man turned, his expression remained blank. His lips were pressed tight, his eyes distant. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice sounding too loud in the suffocating silence. "Is everything okay?" The man didn't respond, nor did he seem to hear Jack. He simply turned away and continued walking. Jack's heart began to race as he realized something far more sinister was at play here. The town was alive, yes, but no one spoke. No one acknowledged the existence of another person. It was as though they were all trapped in a world without sound, bound by an invisible force. He stumbled back, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on him. He had to get out. But something told him it was already too late. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he hurried back to the inn, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence of the street. The people he had seen in the town square weren't looking at him, but their presence was like 100 invisible eyes watching his every move. A creeping sense of paranoia gripped him, tightening with each step. Was it the fog, or was the entire town suffocating under some unseen weight? He pushed open the door to the inn, and the familiar quietness enveloped him like a cold embrace. The lobby was as empty as it had been when he arrived, except now the air felt thick, oppressive. The same woman stood behind the desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, staring into nothing. Her expression had not changed. Without a word, she handed him a small slip of paper. It was the same handwriting as the note in his room. "You're not meant to be here." Jack's blood ran cold. His hand shook as he gripped the paper, staring at the words. What did it mean? And who had written it? He opened his mouth to ask the woman what was going on, but the words never came. The room had fallen into a deathly silence. Even his thoughts seemed muffled. He tried again, but no sound escaped his lips. It was as though something was stopping him from speaking. The woman's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time since Jack had arrived, there was a glimmer of emotion in her gaze. A silent plea, a warning, and then nothing. Her eyes glazed over again, the flicker of recognition gone. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Something was terribly wrong. With growing dread gnawing at his insides, Jack turned and bolted out of the inn. He had to find some answers. He had to break this silence, even if it meant shouting at the top of his lungs. The town was suffocating him. He could feel it in his very bones. But the moment he stepped outside, the air felt different. The fog had grown thicker, pressing down on him as though the sky was trying to swallow the town whole. He could barely see beyond the first row of buildings, and the distant shapes of the townspeople were now little more than shadowy figures wandering aimlessly. Jack walked quickly through the streets, his pulse quickening. His feet carried him to the center of town again, where a small chapel stood, its bell tower barely visible through the heavy mist. The doors were slightly ajar, and, despite himself, Jack found himself drawn inside. The chapel was quiet, utterly still, save for the faint rustling of pages somewhere in the dark. As Jack's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw a figure kneeling in the pews. The person was dressed in a long black robe, their back turned to him. A priest, perhaps? But there was something strange about the figure. They didn't move. Didn't even breathe. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice breaking the silence. Nothing. No reaction. Jack stepped closer, but still, no sound came from the figure. He stopped a few feet away and hesitated before reaching out and touching the person's shoulder. The figure stiffened under his touch, but did not turn. Jack spun them around, and his stomach twisted at the sight. The figure's face was a smooth, blank mask, like the face of a mannequin. There were no features. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just an empty, featureless void where a face should have been. Jack stumbled back, his breath shallow and ragged. The absence of sound was now deafening. He looked around the chapel. No candles flickered, no wind blew through the broken windows, not even a creak from the wooden floors. The entire space felt empty. Hollow. The figure on the pew didn't move. Its expressionless face continued to stare back at Jack. There was nothing human about it. Jack fled the chapel, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He needed answers. He had to find someone who could speak, who could tell him what was happening. He returned to the town square, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense of the nightmare he was in. But it was the same. The people moved, their faces blank, eyes lowered, but there was no speech. No sound. They were like puppets, their strings pulled by an invisible hand. Frustration bubbled up inside Jack. He had to get out of here. He needed to find someone who could explain this madness. He walked toward the edge of town, where the fog seemed to grow even thicker. There, on the outskirts, he saw a small house, one that seemed to stand alone, abandoned, the shutters hanging loosely off the windows. Desperation guided him to the door, his hand trembling as he knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Jack turned the doorknob, and the door creaked open, revealing an empty room inside. It was sparsely furnished, old wooden beams crisscrossing the ceiling. Dust covered every surface, the air stale. He stepped inside, his footsteps muffled on the worn wooden floors. A low whisper drifted through the air. It was faint, like a voice carried by the wind. Jack froze, straining to listen. The whisper was indecipherable at first, but then it became clearer. Leave. Leave before it's too late. The voice was low and raspy, the words fragmented, like they were coming from a great distance. Jack's skin prickled with fear. He turned in the direction of the voice, but the room was empty. No one was there. Who's there? He demanded, his voice hoarse. What is going on here? The silence swallowed his words. The whisper, however, continued. Louder. More insistent. They're coming for you. You can't leave once you've heard the whispers. Jack backed out of the house, his legs trembling beneath him. The weight of those words, the warning, hung heavily in the air. Was it too late for him? Was there a way out of this town? The townspeople continued to walk by, their movements stiff, their eyes unblinking. Jack felt the invisible pressure building, pushing him closer to the edge. He had to leave. But there was no way out. As he stood in the center of the street, the fog around him deepened, the figures of the townspeople closing in. They didn't speak, but Jack could feel their gaze on him, feel them waiting for something he didn't understand. Then, from behind him, he heard it. A voice. A clear, distinct voice, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jack. He spun around, but there was no one there. No one to explain, to tell him what was happening. Just the silent town, watching him with its blank faces. He was alone. The town had become a maze, its streets winding and narrow, but Jack couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt lost. Every path seemed to lead back to the same place, back to the same oppressive quiet. The fog wrapped tighter around him, and with every passing step, the town seemed to shrink as though its walls were closing in. He thought of the warning in the house, the voice, the whispers. They're coming for you. The words echoed in his mind, each repetition sinking deeper into his thoughts. They weren't just words. They were a promise, a sentence. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were already here. He tried to speak to the townspeople again, but it was no use. Each face, each pair of eyes, seemed to stare right through him. There was nothing human in their expressions, only a blankness, a void that Jack couldn't pierce, no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't bear it anymore. He had to leave. He needed to find a way out, to escape this nightmare before it consumed him. He moved toward the town's only exit, hoping that something, anything, would change. But as he reached the edge of the town, he saw a sign, an old wooden sign that hadn't been there before. You can't leave until you remember. The words were scrawled in a jagged, uneven hand. The lettering was bold and almost desperate, as if the person who had written it was trying to make sure that Jack couldn't ignore the message. He felt a chill creep up his spine as he stared at the sign. There was something about the words, something familiar about them, but he couldn't place it. He tried to step past the sign, but as he moved forward, his vision blurred and the fog thickened even more. He turned back toward the town, his body trembling as he fought to comprehend what was happening. Desperation began to claw at Jack's chest as he walked back into the town. He needed answers. He needed someone to explain, to tell him why he was trapped here, why no one spoke, why he couldn't remember anything before his arrival. As he moved deeper into the heart of the town, something shifted in the air. A strange vibration hummed just below his senses, like an electrical pulse running through the ground. It wasn't the fog, it wasn't the silence. It was something more, something older, something deeper. He walked past the silent townspeople, their faces as blank as ever. But this time, he noticed something new. Behind their eyes, just behind that vacant stare, there was something else. A flicker. An almost imperceptible shift, like they were trying to communicate something, but couldn't. Jack stopped in front of one of the people, a middle-aged man in a worn, tattered coat. The man didn't move, but Jack could feel his gaze on him, sharp, like a blade. "Why won't you speak?" Jack asked, his voice low and shaky. "Please. I need to know." The man didn't answer, but Jack thought he saw something, just for a second, something pass over the man's face. It was a grimace, a kind of silent scream. The edges of his mouth twitched in agony, but then the expression vanished, as if it had never existed. A cold sweat dripped down Jack's spine. He stepped back, but the man didn't move. Jack turned, his breath shallow, his pulse quickening. Every corner of the town felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to give in. Jack's feet carried him to a different part of the town, to an old playground surrounded by decaying wooden swings and rusted slides. He approached a small, abandoned sandbox, and there, sitting on the edge, was a child. The child's face was blank, just like all the others, but Jack couldn't ignore the chill that washed over him when their eyes met. The child stared at him without saying a word. Jack couldn't help but approach, the strange pull of the child's gaze stronger than any logic. You can talk, right?" Jack asked, his voice breaking. "You can tell me what's going on here." But the child didn't move, didn't answer. Instead, their gaze remained locked on Jack, and for the first time, he noticed something else. The child's reflection, his own reflection, wasn't visible in the glass of a nearby broken street lamp. Jack turned quickly, his heart thudding against his ribs. He could still feel the child's eyes on him, but now he felt the unmistakable weight of the reflection, or rather, the absence of it. The child, too, had no reflection. No trace of his form was visible in the glass. He looked down at his hands, but when he tried to see his own reflection in a nearby puddle, there was nothing but the gray, empty water. A heavy, suffocating sense of dread overtook him. He looked back at the child, whose eyes were now wide and filled with something that Jack could only describe as fear. "No," Jack whispered, stumbling backward. No. What is happening?" The child's mouth opened, but instead of words, there was only a low, gurgling noise, like something trying to push its way out but being suffocated in the process. And then, just like that, the child stopped moving. The expression faded and the silence returned. The same oppressive quiet that seemed to cling to everything in this town. Jack ran, his mind a blur of confusion and fear. The child's haunting eyes were burned into his brain, and the absence of his own reflection gnawed at him like a fever itch that he couldn't scratch. He needed to escape. He needed to understand. He needed to find out what he was forgetting. His legs carried him back to the inn, his breath ragged, his body trembling. But when he arrived, it wasn't the quiet he had expected. The inn was bustling with activity, people moving in and out, talking, laughing, shouting. The air was thick with noise, like the sound of a crowded bar. Jack stopped in his tracks, his head spinning. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, unsure if what he was seeing was real. The people were no longer silent, they were animated, speaking, moving. The man behind the counter grinned at him as he walked past, and Jack felt the first hint of relief, the first sense of hope. But as he stepped closer to the group gathered by the fireplace, he realized that the laughter they were sharing was hollow. Their faces were all wrong. They were still the same blank, featureless masks. No expression, no real emotion. They moved their mouths, but there was no sound. No laughter. Just the subtle, disturbing impression that they were performing an act. Jack backed away, but as he turned to leave, his foot caught on something. He looked down. On the floor, just inches from his feet, was a shattered mirror. And in the broken shards, his reflection stared back at him. Only it wasn't his reflection. It was a man he didn't recognize, someone he had never seen before. But he knew, deep in his gut, that this man was him. Jack's pulse raced. He backed away from the mirror, but the man in the glass, the one who wasn't him, kept staring. And then the world went silent again. The silence had become unbearable. It wrapped around Jack like a thick fog, a suffocating weight that clung to his lungs. He stood in the inn, the shattered mirror at his feet, the distorted reflection of someone he didn't know still staring back at him. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding against his chest. "What is happening to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped back from the broken glass. But there was no answer, only the silence, heavy and oppressive. As Jack looked around the room, he saw the faces of the townspeople still staring at him, those blank, expressionless masks. They were moving now. They were frozen, like statues, caught in a moment that had no beginning and no end. And Jack knew, deep in his bones, that they were waiting for him to understand. Waiting for him to remember. He turned toward the door, but before he could take a step, a voice cut through the silence. It was a whisper at first, so faint he wasn't sure he had heard it. But then it came again, clearer, stronger. "You're not supposed to be here." The words froze him in place. They came from behind him, from someone he couldn't see. A chill ran down his spine as he slowly turned around. The room was still empty, the people unmoving, their eyes locked on him. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice repeated, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like it came from inside his own head, like a thought that wasn't his own, but still familiar. Jack staggered backward, his mind racing. Who are you?" But there was no response. Just that haunting whisper, filling his ears, filling his mind. Then it hit him. Like a bolt of lightning, it struck him. He remembered. He remembered everything. The town, the faces, the silence, and the terrible truth. Jack's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, his hands trembling as the truth came rushing back to him in a torrent of memories. The town, this place, was not real. None of it was. It was a creation, a dream, a place trapped between worlds. Jack had never been a traveler. He had never stumbled upon this town by accident. He had been brought here, pulled into this place by something beyond his understanding, something dark and ancient. He had thought he was lost, but he wasn't. He had been trapped. Trapped in a place where time didn't exist, where nothing moved forward and nothing moved back. The people of the town, those blank, lifeless faces, were not real either. They were echoes, shadows of something that once was. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was the absence of life itself. The town existed in a space between life and death, between memory and oblivion. And Jack was one of them. One of the forgotten. One of the lost souls who had wandered into this place and been consumed by it. His reflection, the man in the mirror, wasn't a stranger. It was him. The man he had become in this place. The person he had forgotten. And the worst part? He had known this all along. Somewhere, deep inside him, he had always known. The reason he couldn't leave, the reason he couldn't escape, was because he had never truly been alive. Not in this place. Not anymore. As Jack sat there, his mind reeling with the revelation, the room around him began to distort. The walls seemed to bend, and the air grew thick, heavy, like it was suffocating him. The townspeople, those blank, lifeless faces, began to move, but this time it wasn't the slow, mechanical movements he had seen before. This time, they moved with purpose. They circled him, their eyes fixed on him, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. But no sound came. There was only that oppressive silence, that weight, pressing on him from all sides. Jack tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. He stumbled to his feet, his vision blurry, his mind spinning. He needed to get out. He needed to escape this nightmare before it swallowed him whole. But as he turned toward the door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The door, once wide open, was now gone. The room had no exit. No escape. The townspeople closed in on him, their faces twisting in grotesque expressions of agony and terror. Jack reached out, desperate to find a way out, but there was no escape. No way out. The town was a prison, and he was its newest inhabitant. And then, the voice came again, clearer than ever. "You are one of us now." The words were like a blade, cutting through Jack's soul. He screamed, but no sound came from his lips. He reached out, his hands trembling, but it was no use. The people, if they could even be called people anymore, were closing in on him. Their eyes, their mouths, all staring at him, all demanding something from him. And then, the walls of the room began to pulse, like the beating of a heart, growing faster and faster. Jack could feel the pressure building around him, the air growing heavier, thicker. His lungs burned, his chest tightened. The last thing he saw before the world collapsed around him was the reflection in the broken mirror. It was his reflection, No longer the stranger he had seen earlier, but a twisted version of himself, a man broken by time and forgotten by the world. A man who had become nothing but a shadow. And then, the silence returned. When Jack woke, he found himself standing in the middle of the street, the fog swirling around him, thick and suffocating. The town was gone. The people were gone. There was no sign of the inn, no sign of the playground, no sign of the town at all. He looked around, but there was nothing. The world was empty, silent. The only sound was the beating of his own heart. Jack took a step forward, but he stopped. He felt something on his chest, something heavy. When he reached up and touched it, his hand came away with something sticky. Blood. His blood. He looked down, and there, in the ground, was a single, broken mirror shard. And in that shard, he saw his reflection. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There were others standing beside him, shadowy, indistinct figures. They were people he didn't recognize, people who had been trapped here just like him. People who had lost their reflections long ago. The town was not gone. It had never really left. And neither had Jack. Not even when the harsh lights of the hospital would beam into them during routine checkups. They were unnerving to look at, unsettling, so still, so unyielding. In a world of constant motion, of constant human expression, Lena seemed to exist in some kind of suspended animation. A living statue. But the strangest thing about Lena wasn't her lack of blinking. No, it was the way she saw. Or rather, the way she didn't see. The world, to her, was not just ordinary. It was full of things. The kind of things people couldn't see, or rather, things they refused to acknowledge. Ghosts, shadows, things lurking just out of reach, things that would never show themselves except to her. She had always known this was the way it had to be, the way she saw the world differently than everyone else. As a child, she had been terrified of the things she saw in the corner of her eyes, shapes moving, dark figures watching her from behind curtains or across the street, but as she grew older, she learned to ignore them. Or so she thought. But they never went away. They still lurked, always watching, always waiting. Lena learned how to hide her fear, how to play the part of the normal girl in the crowded world. But behind the veneer of normalcy, the dark truths about her eyes remained. And they were starting to resurface. It all started one stormy evening when Lena had gone to bed later than usual. She had been working late at a local cafe, serving coffee and pie to a few regulars. The rain had been coming down in sheets, and the lights in the small town flickered on and off. By the time she returned home, the world outside was cloaked in an eerie, restless quiet. The air smelled of wet earth, and the wind howled as it pushed through the cracks in the windows. The old apartment complex she lived in creaked and groaned like an old house settling after a long day. But Lena didn't think anything of it. She had lived there for months, and the sounds had become as familiar as the ticking of a clock. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as she often did before sleep overtook her. But sleep didn't come. Her mind was too awake, too aware. There was something wrong with the silence, something in the stillness of the room that didn't sit right. Lena's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to grow, stretching slowly, like a living thing. Her heart skipped a beat. She told herself it was just the darkness playing tricks, but her eyes wouldn't leave that corner. The shadow moved, and she could feel it moving toward her, almost as if it were reaching for her. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. Her eyes were locked, fixed on that corner, watching as the shadow shifted and twisted into something more, something she couldn't understand. She wanted to blink, to tear her eyes away, but her eyelids wouldn't obey. The feeling of being watched, of being observed, intensified, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't alone in the room. Something was there with her, something that wasn't human. She tried to sit up, to move, but the weight in the air pressed down on her chest. The shadow was now a figure, tall, thin, and vaguely human, but with no face. It reached out toward her, its long, skeletal fingers stretching, inching closer. The whisper came first. Soft, too soft for anyone else to hear, but so loud in her mind. It was a word, a name. Lena. The figure spoke, but its mouth didn't move. It didn't need to. It was inside her head now. The voice was deep, almost guttural, full of an ancient hunger that made her skin crawl. Lena. It's time. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing ragged as she watched the figure draw closer. And then, finally, her eyes closed. But it wasn't a blink. It wasn't a reflex. She simply closed them as if her mind had willed it. For the first time in her life, she let herself fall into the darkness, into the nothingness behind her eyelids. And when she opened her eyes again, the figure was gone. The next morning, Lena woke up, but something was different. Her eyes felt strange, heavy, as though they had been holding something back for too long. They burned, not from dryness, but from something deeper, something unsettling. She got out of bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor. She looked in the mirror, at her face, her unblinking eyes staring back at her. They were the same, and yet they weren't. They seemed different, more aware, more alive. She wondered briefly if she was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, the sensation of something lurking just outside of her vision, persisted. She went about her day as usual. She worked at the cafe, greeted the regulars, smiled at the customers. But every time she looked into the reflection of the cafe window, every time she passed by the glass door, she felt the same eerie sensation. Something was watching her. Something waiting. By evening, Lena couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at her. She had started seeing things again, the shapes, the shadows, things that moved just out of the corner of her eye. But this time, they were closer. The whispers had returned. Low, insistent. They filled the space between her thoughts, their tone dark and cold. Lena. She spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Her apartment, the cafe, the street outside, everything was just as it should be. But then, in the distance, she saw them. The people. They weren't moving, just standing in the shadows, waiting. And their eyes were fixed on her. Just like hers. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on her skin. Lena felt the walls closing in. There was no escape from the truth. No way out. This was only the beginning. Lena's life had never been ordinary. But now, everything had become unnervingly extraordinary. The feeling of being watched hadn't subsided since the night she closed her eyes for the first time in years. The figure in the corner of her room had been the beginning, a glimpse into something darker, more sinister than she had ever imagined. Her mornings were filled with restless discomfort, a sense of unease that clung to her like a damp cloth. At the cafe, she moved mechanically, her motions almost robotic, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, checking the windows, the reflections, the shadows. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the presence that seemed to follow her everywhere. And then, there were the whispers. They had become more frequent. They echoed through her thoughts, like a voice in the back of her head, always just beyond reach. They weren't loud, not in the way a person might speak to her, but they were there, pressing in from every direction. Lena could feel their cold fingers on the edges of her mind. Lena, you can't escape. We're watching you. It was maddening. It wasn't like voices in her head, not like the intrusive thoughts one might experience during a panic attack. No, this was different. The whispers had weight. They were persistent, relentless, and they had substance. They followed her in every reflection, in every window, in the stillness of her room at night. The figure that had appeared in her bedroom wasn't gone. It hadn't left, not in the way one might expect. It had simply moved into the background, waiting for the right moment. The right time. Every reflection Lena saw now was tainted. The mirror was a distorted version of her, a woman trapped in a glass cage, staring back at her with eyes that never blinked. The worst part was how the whispers were now coming from the mirrors. It didn't matter where Lena went, which mirror she passed, she could hear the same words, the same chilling tone. It was as if the mirrors were alive, breathing her in, watching her every move. And the more she tried to ignore it, the worse it became. One afternoon, after the cafe had cleared out, Lena decided she couldn't take it anymore. The mirrors were driving her mad. The presence had become unbearable. She needed to leave. To escape. She had heard of a small town a few miles away, one that wasn't too far, but just isolated enough to give her some distance from the ever-present eyes of her apartment, her workplace. The town was known for its tranquility, a perfect getaway for someone who needed to get away from it all. So, that's where she went. When she arrived, the town was shrouded in fog, the kind that creeps in slowly and lingers in the streets. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture, but there was something more to it, a subtle unease that seemed to hang in the atmosphere. The town felt frozen in time, like a scene from a forgotten movie, preserved in perfect stillness. Lena walked through the streets, her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The buildings were old, weathered by time, their wooden frames creaking with the wind's sigh. People moved around her, but none of them spoke. They didn't greet her, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. It was as if they were completely unaware of her, moving with purpose but not looking at her, not even glancing her way. Lena's stomach tightened. This was wrong. Everything about this place felt wrong. She paused at a small cafe, its windows fogged over, a single lamp casting a dim glow from inside. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, seeking some warmth from the chill that had settled in her bones. The barista, a thin man with dark eyes, stood behind the counter. He didn't smile when he saw her. He didn't speak. Instead, he just pointed toward an empty table in the corner, his finger tracing the air like an unspoken command. Lena sat down, the silence in the room oppressive. The people around her continued to move, but their faces were blank, expressionless. She could hear the soft clink of a spoon against a cup, the scrape of chairs against the floor, but no voices. Not a single word. The eerie silence was suffocating, and Lena felt her skin crawl, as though something was just beneath the surface, something dark, waiting. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the menu. There was no text on it, only blank spaces. Her eyes flickered back to the barista. His face was as expressionless as the others, no smile, no frown, no recognition. Something was very wrong here. And for the first time in weeks, Lena felt the familiar presence creeping back. It wasn't the whispers this time. No, this felt different. This felt like the town itself was watching her, like the people, the buildings, the very air was all a part of the same thing. They all knew something she didn't. A low hum began to vibrate in the room, barely noticeable at first, but growing louder, like a distant drone, as if the town itself were breathing. The barista finally spoke, his voice low and mechanical. "Do not blink," he said, his words lingering in the still air. Lena's heart stopped. Her blood ran cold. The entire room went silent. The people froze. Their eyes were fixed on her, unmoving, unblinking, just like hers. The pressure in the room intensified. Do not blink. Lena felt a chill ripple down her spine. This was no longer a town. This was a trap. Lena's breathing quickened, and the barista's words echoed in her mind. Do not blink. What was happening? Why was he saying this to her? She felt the growing sense of dread, the terror of being trapped in a world that was unraveling around her, closing in like a vice. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor, but no one moved. No one reacted. The humming sound increased, vibrating through her body like a pulse. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, but there was none. The door was locked. The windows, too. She tried the door again, pushing with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. And then, as if on cue, the barista spoke again, his voice even colder than before. Stay, he said. You have nowhere to go. Stay, and you'll see everything. Lena felt the walls closing in, the room pressing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, more demanding. Don't blink. You can't escape. Stay with us. In that moment, Lena understood. This was no ordinary town. This was no ordinary place. The people here, their eyes, their movements, they were all part of something larger, something terrifying. She was being watched. Watched by them. Watched by something that never blinked. And as she turned to flee, something even more horrifying happened. The mirror behind the barista's counter began to ripple. The reflection in the glass shimmered, and slowly, like the tide pulling back, the face that stared back at Lena was not hers. It was the figure from her room. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figure in the mirror began to take shape. It wasn't just the face she had seen before, it was something more. The contours of the reflection shifted and twisted, becoming distorted, and for a moment, it seemed to crawl across the glass like a living thing. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, just like hers, eyes that never blinked. Her hands trembled, and a wave of nausea surged in her gut. The barista's eyes never wavered from her, but his face remained expressionless, as though he could feel the growing panic in her body without acknowledging it. Behind him, the mirror seemed to grow colder, the shadows within it deeper. The figure on the glass was alive, its stare freezing, paralyzing, as though it were waiting, biding its time. "Stay," the barista's voice rasped again, the words barely a whisper. Lena's legs buckled beneath her, and she stumbled back, her body slamming into the cold metal of the counter. Her eyes couldn't look away from the reflection. It was like a deep, black hole pulling her in, an abyss that seemed to hold every fear she had ever experienced, every doubt and every unspoken terror. "Don't blink, Lena. Don't you dare blink." The whispering was louder now. It wasn't just in her head anymore, it was all around her, in the air, in the space between the townsfolk, in the very walls of the cafe. The room itself seemed to be holding its breath. With all the strength she could muster, Lena forced her eyes away from the mirror, her heartbeat loud in her ears, the pulse of her veins echoing through her skull. She focused on the barista instead, his blank, emotionless face, and his stillness that mirrored the silence of the town. "Why?" Lena's voice was barely a sound. She tried to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to ask first. How did he know about her? About the mirrors? The thing in her room? The barista tilted his head slightly, his eyes cold and knowing. Then, in that same hollow, monotonous tone, he answered her. "The town is part of it, Lena. You've come to the wrong place. But now that you're here, you can't leave." Lena's breath caught, the words sinking deep into her chest like a stone dropped into a well. "Why can't I leave?" she whispered. He didn't answer at first. Instead, his eyes darted to the other customers, who still moved in that same eerie silence. All of them, every one of them, had turned their heads to stare at her, their blank, unblinking eyes fixed on her, as if they were waiting for something. The tension was unbearable, a thick fog that clouded every thought. "Because you never blinked," the barista finally said. "None of us blinked. The town takes those who are like us." Lena's skin prickled as she tried to process what he was saying. What did that mean? She had never blinked, but what did that matter? And why was the town so different from anything she had ever known? "You're not just any one of us," the barista added, his voice quieter now. "You were chosen." The cafe felt more suffocating with each passing second, the air growing heavier, as if the very space around her was beginning to close in, crushing her chest. She fought for control, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. She could feel the weight of the town pressing down on her like an invisible force, the eerie stillness closing in. Lena's eyes flitted back to the mirror. The figure was still there, staring at her with its cold, unblinking eyes, its lips unmoving, but Lena could feel it smiling at her, smiling in the way that something monstrous smiles when it knows something you don't. The hum that had been growing in the cafe intensified, now vibrating beneath her feet, traveling through her bones. It was coming from the mirrors. She could feel it. The mirrors were alive. The barista's face remained still, but his eyes flickered with an unsettling gleam. "It's always been like this here," he continued, his tone now almost like a lullaby, soft and ominous. "Those who come are drawn to it, drawn to the mirrors. They offer an escape, but only for a price." Lena could hardly breathe. "What price?" she asked, her voice shaky, uncertain. "You'll see soon enough," the barista replied, a flicker of something dark in his eyes. The moment those words left his mouth, a sharp crack echoed through the cafe, like a distant thunderclap. Lena whipped her head toward the source, heart pounding in her chest. The mirror behind the barista had shattered. But not entirely. No, instead of the glass breaking into pieces, the cracks spread out like veins, tendrils of darkness weaving through the reflection, distorting the scene before her. The barista's face blurred, and the edges of the cafe began to warp, twisting like smoke. In the distorted mirror, Lena saw herself standing, unmoving. But in the shadowed corners, something began to take shape. Something with eyes. "Don't blink, Lena." The whispers were everywhere now, vibrating through her mind, wrapping around her thoughts. She felt as if her very soul was being pulled toward the shattered mirror, as though the thing in it was calling to her, pulling at her like gravity. Lena's chest tightened, and she stumbled back from the counter, knocking over her chair in the process. She tried to run, tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The mirrors were everywhere. She could see them through the windows, reflecting the fog and shadows outside. And then, just as she thought she could escape, she turned toward the back of the cafe. There, in the farthest corner, stood a door she had never seen before. It was the only way out. With every ounce of willpower she could summon, Lena sprinted toward the door, her heart racing in her chest. As she reached for the handle, she could feel the presence closing in around her. The mirrors were growing darker, the shadows thicker, and behind her, the whispers had turned into a screeching cacophony, the sound of millions of voices calling her name. The door opened with a squeal of hinges, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face as she stepped into the darkened space. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud, leaving her in total darkness. But then, she felt it. The air was heavier here, suffocating, as if she were standing underwater. The whispers grew louder. And slowly, as her eyes adjusted, she realized the truth. She was no longer in the cafe. She was standing in a mirror. Lena's reflection grinned at her from the far side of the glass, its eyes never blinking. Lena's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it seemed to echo in the suffocating darkness around her. She staggered back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She had crossed through the door, but now, instead of a way out, she found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. A place that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of her perception. She could still hear the buzzing whispers, a constant, droning hum, but it wasn't just coming from the air. It was coming from the mirror itself, the glass, cold and unforgiving, reflecting the space she now found herself in. A space that seemed to be part of the mirror. The walls were smooth, too smooth. They glistened with condensation, and as her fingers brushed against them, they felt slick and clammy, like the inside of a tomb. The air was thick, dense with something oppressive, something that felt ancient and wrong. The mirror's surface in front of her distorted slightly, rippling as though it were alive. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It wasn't her anymore. Lena's reflection was smiling. No, it wasn't smiling. It was grinning. And in that smile was something malevolent, something twisted and hungry. Her reflection's eyes were wide, unblinking, and behind the sheen of glass, the darkness in them was infinite. The reflection tilted its head, as if considering her, as if it knew her more intimately than she knew herself. "Do you see?" the reflection whispered, its voice an echo of her own. Lena stumbled backward, her breath hitching. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, and as her fingers made contact, the reflection did the same. But it wasn't the same. No, it wasn't. The reflection moved on its own, twisting and warping, its features becoming more grotesque with every passing second. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice like nails scraping across a chalkboard. "But now that you're here, there's no going back." Lena's pulse raced as the whispers grew louder, now filling the space around her, flooding her mind. She could no longer differentiate between the whispers and her own thoughts. They had merged, inseparable. The very air seemed to thicken, to press in on her, suffocating her. The reflection's grin widened, and for the first time, Lena saw teeth, sharp, jagged teeth, gleaming in the dim light. It was a reflection of her, yes, but it was wrong. Every movement, every expression was twisted, distorted. "Look at us," the reflection crooned. "We are one now. You and I. I've waited for this, Lena." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" she gasped, her voice breaking. "What are you talking about?" The reflection didn't answer at first. Instead, it stepped closer to the glass, its face contorting in a grotesque manner. The grin never left, and its eyes, those empty, unblinking eyes, seemed to grow darker, deeper. "You've been here before," it said, its voice a soft, mocking tone. "Every time you've looked into a mirror, every time you've been drawn to it, you've been pulled a little closer. And now," the reflection smile stretched impossibly wide, "now it's too late." Lena's chest tightened. She didn't understand. How could she? She had only come to this town seeking an escape, trying to outrun the horrors of her own life. She had never asked for this. She turned her head sharply, looking around her, desperate for some kind of way out. The space she was in was no longer a room, but something else, something empty, a vast, endless void. It stretched before her, an ocean of mirrors reflecting her every move. She felt something cold brush against her cheek, her own hand reaching through the glass. No, this couldn't be happening. But she could feel it now. It was true. She had never blinked. Not once. And now it was too late. The mirrors, the town, the people who had never spoken, they had been waiting for her. For someone like her. Someone who had crossed the threshold of the unblinking stare. "You belong to us now," the reflection whispered, its voice growing louder, taking on 1,000 different tones. "You've always belonged to us." Lena's mind reeled, her thoughts splintering as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. The mirrors were more than just glass. They were gateways. Gateways that opened to something ancient, something that had always watched her. It had always been there, in the darkness behind the mirrors, waiting for her to step too close, waiting for her to never blink. The people in the town, they weren't just townsfolk. They were part of it. They were the keepers of the mirrors, the ones who had made the deal long ago. A deal that bound them to the mirrors, to the darkness behind them. They were trapped, just like her. She had become part of it. She had been chosen. "Now, Lena," the reflection cooed, its smile widening, "you'll never blink again. And you'll never leave." You'll be like us. We'll be together. The whispers were deafening now. Lena could barely think over the screeching voices that filled her mind. Her reflection, the thing behind the mirror, was pulling her in. The darkness in its eyes was pulling at her very soul, dragging her into the depths of the glass. And yet, as she stood there, paralyzed with fear, a single thought pierced through the chaos. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just let this happen. Not after everything. Not after all she had been through. The reflection reached out to her, its hand pressed against the glass, just inches from hers. But Lena wouldn't let it. She wouldn't let herself be swallowed whole. Not by this thing. Not by the mirrors. Lena's eyes burned as she held back the urge to blink, to close her eyes and escape, to give into the darkness. But she couldn't. Not yet. You can leave, a voice inside her head whispered. It wasn't the reflection. It was a different voice, a voice that felt familiar. One that had been with her all along. The voice she had never listened to before. Blink, it said. Blink, and the deal is over. Lena hesitated. Her body ached with the strain of keeping her eyes open. Her vision blurred, her eyelids heavy, but she fought against it. I have to blink, she thought. She had to. But the reflection was still grinning, still watching her. It was only a moment away from pulling her in. And then, with a surge of strength she didn't know she had, Lena blinked. The world shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. Lena's body jerked forward, and her vision went black. When her eyes opened again, she was lying on the cold floor of the cafe. The mirrors were gone. The people were gone. The air was still, silent, and thick with the remnants of the nightmare. Lena was alone. But as she stood up, she noticed something chilling. Her reflection was still there. In the corner of the cafe window, just beyond the glass. The eyes that stared back at her were unblinking, just like before. But this time, they weren't hers. And the reflection smiled.